Witches by Roald Dahl. Read by Simon Callow. A note about witches. In fairy tales, witches always wear silly black hats and black cloaks, and they ride on broomsticks. But this is not a fairy tale. This is about real witches. The most important thing you should know about real witches is this. Listen very carefully. Never forget what is coming next. Real witches dress in ordinary clothes and look very much like ordinary women. They live in ordinary houses and they work in ordinary jobs. That is why they are so hard to catch. A real witch hates children with a red-hot, sizzling hatred that is more sizzling and red-hot than any hatred you could possibly imagine. A real witch spends all her time plotting to get rid of the children in her particular territory. It is all she thinks about the whole day long. Even if she's working as a cashier in a supermarket, or typing letters for a businessman, or driving around in a fancy car, and she could be doing any of these things, her mind will always be plotting and scheming and churning and burning and whizzing and fizzing with murderous, bloodthirsty thoughts. "Which child?" she says to herself all day long. "Exactly which child shall I choose for my next squelching?" A real witch gets the same pleasure from squelching a child as you get from eating a plateful of strawberries and thick cream. She reckons on doing away with one child a week. Anything less than that, and she becomes grumpy. "One child a week is 52 a year. Squish them and squiggle them and make them disappear." That is the motto of all witches. Very carefully, a victim is chosen. Then the witch stalks the wretched child like a hunter stalking a little bird in the forest. She treads softly. She moves quietly. She gets closer and closer. Then at last, when everything is ready, and she swoops. Sparks fly, flames leap, oil boils, rats howl, skin shrivels, and the child disappears. A witch never gets caught. Don't forget that she has magic in her fingers and devilry dancing in her blood. She can make stones jump about like frogs, and she can make tongues of flame go flickering across the surface of the water. These magic powers are very frightening. Luckily, there are not a great number of real witches in the world today, but there are still quite enough to make you nervous. In England, there are probably about 100 of them altogether. Some countries have more, others have not quite so many. No country in the world is completely free from witches. A witch is always a woman. I do not wish to speak badly about women. Most women are lovely, but the fact remains that all witches are women. There is no such thing as a male witch. On the other hand, a ghoul is always a male. So indeed is a bar guest. Both are dangerous, but neither of them is half as dangerous as a real witch. As far as children are concerned, a real witch is easily the most dangerous of all the living creatures on earth. What makes her doubly dangerous is the fact that she doesn't look dangerous. Even when you know all the secrets, you will hear about those in a minute, you can still never be quite sure whether it is a witch you are gazing at, or just a kind lady. For all you know, a witch might be living next door to you right now. Or she might be the woman with the bright eyes who sat opposite you on the bus this morning. She might be the lady with the dazzling smile who offered you a sweet from a white paper bag in the street before lunch. She might even, and this will make you jump, she might even be your lovely school teacher. Look carefully at that teacher. Perhaps she is smiling. Don't let that put you off. It could be part of her cleverness. I'm not, of course, telling you for 1 second that your teacher actually is a witch. All I'm saying is that she might be one. It is most unlikely. But, and here comes the big but, it is not impossible. Oh, if only there were a way of telling for sure whether a woman was a witch or not. Then we could round them all up and put them in the meat grinder. Unhappily, there is no such way. But there are a number of little signals you can look out for, little quirky habits that all witches have in common, and if you know about these, if you remember them always, then you might just possibly manage to escape from being squelched before you were very much older. I myself had 2 separate encounters with witches before I was 8 years old. From the first I escaped unharmed, but on the second occasion I was not so lucky. Things happened to me that will probably make you scream when you read about them. That can't be helped. The truth must be told. The fact that I'm still here and able to speak to you, however peculiar I may look, is due entirely to my wonderful grandmother. My grandmother was Norwegian. The Norwegians know all about witches, for Norway, with its black forests and icy mountains, is where the first witches came from. My father and my mother were also Norwegian, but because my father had a business in England, I had been born there and had lived there and had started going to an English school. Twice a year, at Christmas and in the summer, we went back to Norway to visit my grandmother. This old lady, as far as I could gather, was just about the only surviving relative we had on either side of the family. She was my mother's mother, and I absolutely adored her. Soon after my 7th birthday, my parents took me, as usual, to spend Christmas with my grandmother in Norway, and it was over there, while my father and mother and I were driving in icy weather just north of Oslo, that our car skidded off the road and went tumbling down into a rocky ravine. My parents were killed. I was firmly strapped into the back seat and received only a cut on the forehead. I won't go into the horrors of that terrible afternoon. I still get the shivers when I think about it. I finished up, of course, back in my grandmother's house with her arms round me tight, and both of us crying the whole night long. "What are we going to do now?" I asked her through the tears. "You will stay here with me," she said, "and I will look after you." "Aren't I going back to England?" "No," she said. "I could never do that. Heaven shall take my soul, but Norway shall keep my bones." The very next day, in order that we might both try to forget our great sadness, my grandmother started telling me stories. She was a wonderful storyteller, and I was enthralled by everything she told me. But I didn't become really excited until she got onto the subject of witches. She was apparently a great expert on these creatures, and she made it very clear to me that her witch stories, unlike most of the others, were not imaginary tales. Everything she was telling me about witches had actually happened, and I had better believe it. What was worse, what was far, far worse, was that witches were still with us. "Are you really being truthful, Grandmamma? Really and truly truthful?" "My darling," she said, "you won't last long in this world if you don't know how to spot a witch when you see one." "But you told me that witches look like ordinary women, Grandmamma. So how can I spot them?" "You must listen to me," my grandmother said. "You must remember everything I tell you. After that, all you can do is cross your heart and pray to heaven and hope for the best." We were in the big living room of her house in Oslo, and I was ready for bed. The curtains were never drawn in that house, and through the windows I could see huge snowflakes falling slowly onto an outside world that was as black as tar. My grandmother was tremendously old and wrinkled, with a massive, wide body which was smothered in grey lace. She sat there majestic in her armchair. I myself, just 7 years old, was crouched on the floor at her feet, wearing pyjamas, dressing gown, and slippers. "You swear you aren't pulling my leg," I kept saying to her. "You swear you aren't just pretending." "Listen," she said. "I have known no less than 5 children who have simply vanished off the face of this earth, never to be seen again. The witches took them." "I still think you're just trying to frighten me." "I'm trying to make sure you don't go the same way. I love you, and I want you to stay with me." "Tell me about the children who disappeared," I said. My grandmother was the only grandmother I ever met who smoked cigars. She lit one now, a long black cigar that smelt of burning rubber. "The first child I knew who disappeared," she said, "was called Ragnhild Hansen. Ragnhild was about 8 at the time, and she was playing with her little sister on the lawn. Their mother, who was baking bread in the kitchen, came outside for a breath of air. 'Where's Ragnhild?' she asked. 'She went away with the tall lady,' the little sister said. 'What tall lady?' the mother said. 'The tall lady in white gloves,' the little sister said. 'She took Ragnhild by the hand and led her away. No one,' my grandmother said, ever saw Ragnhild again." "Didn't they search for her?" I asked. "They searched for miles around. Everyone in the town helped, but they never found her." "What happened to the other 4 children?" "They vanished, just as Ragnhild did." "How, Grandmama? How did they vanish?" "In every case, a strange lady was seen outside the house just before it happened." "But how did they vanish?" I asked. "The second one was very peculiar," my grandmother said. "There was a family called Christiansen. They lived up in Holmenkollen, and they had an old oil painting in the living room which they were very proud of. The painting showed some ducks in the yard outside a farmhouse. There were no people in the painting, just a flock of ducks on a grassy farmyard, and the farmhouse in the background. It was a large painting, and rather pretty. Well, one day, their daughter Solveig came home from school eating an apple. She said a nice lady had given it to her on the street. The next morning, little Solveig was not in her bed. The parents searched everywhere, but they couldn't find her. Then all of a sudden, her father shouted, "There she is! That's Solveig feeding the ducks!" He was pointing at the oil painting. And sure enough, Solveig was in it. She was standing in the farmyard in the act of throwing bread to the ducks out of a basket. The father rushed up to the painting and touched her. But that didn't help. She was simply a part of the painting. Just a picture painted on the canvas. "Did you ever see that painting, Grandmama, with the little girl in it?" "Many times," my grandmother said. "And the peculiar thing was that little Solveig kept changing her position in the picture. One day she would actually be inside the farmhouse, and you could see her face looking out of the window. Another day she would be far over to the left, with a duck in her arms." "Did you see her moving in the picture, Grandmama?" "Nobody did. Wherever she was, whether outside feeding the ducks or inside looking out of the window, she was always motionless. And what was most odd of all was that as the years went by, she kept growing older in the picture. In 10 years, the small girl had become a young woman. In 30 years, she was middle-aged. Then all at once, 54 years after it all happened, she disappeared from the picture altogether." "You mean she died?" I said. "Who knows?" "That's 2 you've told me about," I said. "What happened to the third one?" "The third one was little Birgit Svensson," my grandmother said. "She lived just across the road from us. One day she started growing feathers all over her body. Within a month, She had turned into a large white chicken. Her parents kept her for years in a pen in the garden. I gazed at my grandmother. But the little girl who became a chicken didn't disappear, I said. No, not Birgit. She lived on for many years. You said all of them disappeared. I made a mistake, my grandmother said. I'm getting old. I can't remember everything. What happened to the fourth child? I asked. The fourth was a boy called Harald. One morning his skin went all greyish-yellow. Then it became hard and crackly like the shell of a nut. By evening, the boy had turned to stone. Stone? You mean real stone? Granite. I'll take you to see him if you like. They still keep him in the house. He stands in the hall, a little stone statue. Visitors lean their umbrellas up against him. Though I was very young, I was not prepared to believe everything my grandmother told me, and yet she spoke with such conviction that I found myself beginning to wonder. Go on, Grandmamma, I said. What about number 5? Number 5 was rather an interesting case. A 9-year-old boy called Leif was summer holidaying with his family on the fjord, and the whole family was picnicking and swimming off some rocks on one of those little islands. Young Leif dived into the water, and his father, who was watching him, noticed that he stayed under for an unusually long time. When he came to the surface at last, he wasn't Leif anymore. What was he, Grandmamma? He was a porpoise. He couldn't have been. He was a lovely young porpoise, and as friendly as could be. Grandmamma, I said. Yes, my darling. Did he really and truly turn into a porpoise? Absolutely. I knew his mother well. But, Grandmamma, I said, how did they know that the porpoise was actually Leif? He talked to them. He laughed and joked with them all the time. But wasn't there a most tremendous fuss when this happened? Not much, my grandmother said. You must remember that here in Norway we are used to that sort of thing. There are witches everywhere. It's time you went to bed. A witch wouldn't come in through my window in the night, would she? I asked, quaking a little. No, my grandmother said. A witch will never do silly things like climbing up drain pipes or breaking into people's houses. You'll be quite safe in your bed. Come along. I'll tuck you in. The next evening, after my grandmother had given me my bath, she took me once again into the living room for another story. Tonight I'm going to tell you how to recognize a witch when you see one. In the first place, she said, a real witch is certain always to be wearing gloves when you meet her. Surely not always, I said. What about in the summer when it's hot? Even in the summer. You want to know why? Why? Because she doesn't have fingernails. Instead of fingernails, she has thin, curvy claws like a cat, and she wears the gloves to hide them. Mamma used to wear gloves. Not in the house. Witches wear gloves even in the house. The second thing to remember is that the real witch is always bald. Bald? Bald as a boiled egg, my grandmother said. If she's bald, she'll be easy to spot. Not at all. A real witch always wears a wig to hide her baldness. She wears a first-class wig, and it is almost impossible to tell a really first-class wig from ordinary hair unless you give it a pull to see if it comes off. Then that's what I'll have to do. Don't be foolish, my grandmother said. You can't go around pulling at the hair of every lady you meet, even if she is wearing gloves. So that doesn't help much either, I said. "None of these things is any good on its own. It's only when you put them all together. What other things must I look for to recognize a witch?" "Look for the nose holes. Witches have slightly larger nose holes than ordinary people. The rim of each nose hole is pink and curvy, like the rim of a certain kind of a seashell." "Why do they have such big nose holes?" "For smelling with," my grandmother said. "A real witch has the most amazing powers of smell. She can actually smell out a child who is standing on the other side of the street on a pitch-black night." "She couldn't smell me," I said. "I've just had a bath." "Oh, yes, she could," my grandmother said. "The cleaner you happen to be, the more smelly you are to a witch." "That can't be true." "An absolutely clean child gives off the most ghastly stench to a witch. The dirtier you are, the less you smell." "But that doesn't make sense, Grandmama." "Oh, yes, it does. It isn't the dirt that the witch is smelling. It is you. The smell that drives a witch mad actually comes right out of your own skin. When you haven't washed for a week, and your skin is all covered over with dirt, then quite obviously the stink waves cannot come oozing out nearly so strongly." "I shall never have a bath again," I said. "Just don't have one too often," my grandmother said. "Once a month is quite enough for a sensible child." It was at moments like this that I loved my grandmother more than ever. "Grandmama," I said, "if it's a dark night, how can a witch smell the difference between a child and a grown-up?" "Because grown-ups don't give out stink waves. Only children do that." "But I don't really give out stink waves, do I? I'm not giving them out at this very moment, am I?" "Not to me, you aren't," my grandmother said. "To me you're smelling like raspberries and cream. But to a witch, you would be smelling absolutely disgusting." "What would I be smelling of?" I said. "Dog's droppings," my grandmother said. "Dog's droppings?" I cried. "I am not smelling of dog's droppings. I don't believe it." "So if you see a woman holding her nose as she passes you in the street," she went on, "that woman could easily be a witch." I decided to change the subject. "Tell me what else to look for in a witch." "The eyes. Look carefully at the eyes, because the eyes of a real witch are different from yours and mine. Look in the middle of each eye, where there is normally a little black dot. If she is a witch, the black dot will keep changing color, and you will see fire and you will see ice dancing right in the very center of the colored dot. It will send shivers running all over your skin." My grandmother leant back in her chair and sucked away contentedly at her foul black cigar. She looked deadly serious. "Are there other things?" "Of course there are other things," my grandmother said. "You don't seem to understand that witches are not actually women at all. They look like women, they talk like women, and they are able to act like women. But in actual fact, they are totally different animals. They are demons in human shape." "What else is different about them, Grandmama?" "The feet. Witches never have toes." "No toes?" I cried. "Then what do they have?" "They just have feet." "The feet have square ends with no toes on them at all." "Does that make it difficult to walk?" I asked. "Not at all. But it does give them a problem with their shoes. A witch has the most awful job squeezing her feet into those neat little pointed shoes." "Why doesn't she wear wide, comfy shoes with square ends?" "She dare not," my grandmother said. "Just as she hides her baldness with a wig, she must also hide her ugly witch's feet by squeezing them into pretty shoes." "Isn't that terribly uncomfortable?" "Extremely uncomfortable," my grandmother said, "but she has to put up with it." "Are those the only differences then, Grandmama?" "There's one more." my grandmother said. Just one more. What is it, Grandmama? Their spit is blue. Blue? I cried. Not blue. Their spit can't be blue. Nobody can have blue spit. Witches can. Is it like ink? Exactly. They even use it to write with. They use those old-fashioned pens that have nibs, and they simply lick the nib. Can you notice the blue spit, Grandmama? If a witch was talking to me, would I be able to notice it? Only if you looked carefully. If you looked very carefully, you would probably see a slight bluish tinge on her teeth, but it doesn't show much. It would if she spat, I said. Witches never spit. They daren't. I couldn't believe my grandmother would be lying to me. She went to church every morning of the week, and she said grace before every meal, and somebody who did that would never tell lies. So there you are, my grandmother said. That's about all I can tell you. You can still never be absolutely sure whether a woman is a witch or not just by looking at her. But if she's wearing the gloves, if she has the large nose holes, the queer eyes, and the hair that looks as though it might be a wig, and if she has a bluish tinge on her teeth, if she has all of these things, then you run like mad. Grandmama, I said, when you were a little girl, did you ever meet a witch? Once, my grandmother said. Only once. What happened? I'm not going to tell you. It would frighten you out of your skin and give you bad dreams. Please tell me. No. Does it have something to do with your missing thumb? I asked. Suddenly, her old wrinkled lips shut tight as a pair of tongs, and the hand that held the cigar, which had no thumb on it, began to quiver very slightly. I waited. She didn't look at me. The conversation was finished. Good night, Grandmama, I said, rising from the floor and kissing her on the cheek. She didn't move. I crept out of the room and went to my bedroom. The next day, a man in a black suit arrived at the house carrying a briefcase, and he held a long conversation with my grandmother in the living room. When at last he went away, my grandmother came in to me, walking very slowly and looking very sad. That man was reading me your father's will, she said. What is a will? I asked her. It is something you write before you die, and in it you say who is going to have your money and your property. But most important of all, it says who is going to look after your child, if both the mother and the father are dead. A fearful panic took hold of me. Grandmama, I cried, I don't have to go to somebody else, do I? No, your father would never have done that. He has asked me to take care of you for as long as I live. But he has also asked that I take you back to your own house in England. He wants us to stay there. But why? Why can't we stay here in Norway? You would hate to live anywhere else. I know. But there are a lot of complications with money and with the house that you wouldn't understand. Also, it said in the will that although all your family is Norwegian, you were born in England and you've started your education there, and your father wants you to continue going to English schools. Oh, Grandmama, I said, you don't want to go and live in our English house. I know you don't. Of course I don't. But I'm afraid I must. There was no way out of it. We had to go to England, and my grandmother started making arrangements at once. Your next school term begins in a few days, she said, so we don't have any time to waste. On the evening before we left, my grandmother got onto her favourite subject once again. There are not as many witches in England as there are in Norway, she said. I'm sure I won't meet one, I said. I sincerely hope you won't, because those English witches are probably the most vicious in the whole world. She sat there, smoking her foul cigar and talking away. I kept looking at the hand with the missing thumb. I was fascinated by it, and I kept wondering what awful thing had happened that time when she had met a witch. It must have been something absolutely appalling. I couldn't help trying to guess. Tell me what those English witches do, Grandmama, I said.
"Well," she said, sucking away at her stinking cigar, "their favourite ruse is to mix up a powder that will turn a child into some creature or other that all grown-ups hate."
"What sort of a creature, Grandmamma?"
"Often it's a slug," she said. "A slug is one of their favourites. Then the grown-ups step on the slug and squish it without knowing it's a child."
"That's perfectly beastly."
"Or it might be a flea," my grandmother said. "They might turn you into a flea, and without realizing what she was doing, your own mother would get out the flea powder, and then it's goodbye to you."
"You're making me nervous. I really don't want to go to England, Grandmamma."
"Of course you don't. Nor do I. But I'm afraid we've got to."
"Are witches different in every country?"
I asked. "Completely different. But I don't know much about the other countries."
"Don't you even know about America?"
I asked. "Not really. Although I have heard it said that over there the witches are able to make the grown-ups eat their own children."
"Never! Oh, no, Grandmamma, that couldn't be true."
"I don't know whether it's true or not. It's only a rumour I've heard."
"But how could they possibly make them eat their own children?"
"By turning them into hot dogs. That wouldn't be too difficult for a clever witch."
"Does every single country in the world have its witches?" I asked.
"Wherever you find people, you find witches," my grandmother said. "There's a secret society of witches in every country."
"And do they all know one another, Grandmamma?"
"They do not," she said. "A witch only knows the witches in her own country. She is strictly forbidden to communicate with any foreign witches. But an English witch, for example, will know all the other witches in England. They are all friends. And once a year, the witches of each separate country hold their own secret meeting. They all get together in one place to receive a lecture from the Grand High Witch of all the world."
"From who?"
"She is the ruler of them all," my grandmother said. "She is all-powerful. She is without mercy. All other witches are petrified of her. They see her only once a year at their annual meeting. She goes there to whip up excitement and enthusiasm, and to give orders. The Grand High Witch travels from country to country, attending these annual meetings."
"Where do they have these meetings, Grandmamma?"
"There are all sorts of rumours," my grandmother answered. "I've heard it said that they just book into an hotel like any other group of women who are holding a meeting. I've also heard it said that some very peculiar things go on in the hotels they stay in. It is rumoured that the beds are never slept in, that there are burn marks on the bedroom carpets, that toads are discovered in the bathtubs, and that down in the kitchen the cook once found a baby crocodile swimming in his saucepan of soup." My grandmother picked up her cigar and took another puff, inhaling the foul smoke deeply into her lungs.
"Where does the Grand High Witch live when she's at home?" I asked.
"Nobody knows," my grandmother said. "If we knew that, then she would be rooted out and destroyed. Witchophiles all over the world have spent their lives trying to discover the secret headquarters of the Grand High Witch."
"What is a witchophile, Grandmamma?"
"A person who studies witches, that knows a lot about them."
"Are you a witchophile, Grandmamma?"
"I'm a retired witchophile. When I was younger, I travelled all over the globe trying to track down the Grand High Witch. I never came even close to succeeding."
"Is she rich?"
"She's rolling. Simply rolling in money. My guess is that the Grand High Witch makes all the money she wants and she dishes it out to witches everywhere."
"But, Grandmamma," I said, "if nobody has ever seen the Grand High Witch, how can you be so sure she exists?" My grandmother gave me a long and very severe look.
"Nobody has ever seen the devil," she said, "but we know he exists."
The next morning we sailed for England, and soon I was back in the old family house in Kent, but this time with only my grandmother to look after me. Then the Easter term began, and every weekday I went to school, and everything seemed to have come back to normal again. Now, at the bottom of our garden there was an enormous conker tree, and high up in its branches, Timmy, my best friend, and I had started to build a magnificent tree house. We were able to work on it only at the weekends, but we were getting along fine. One Saturday afternoon, when Timmy was in bed with flu, I decided to make a start on the roof. Then suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I caught sight of a woman standing immediately below me. She was looking up at me and smiling in the most peculiar way. When most people smile, their lips go out sideways. This woman's lips went upwards and downwards, showing all her front teeth and gums. The gums were like raw meat. It is always a shock to discover that you're being watched when you think you're alone. And what was this strange woman doing in our garden, anyway? I noticed that she was wearing a small black hat, and she had black gloves on her hands, and the gloves came nearly up to her elbows. Gloves! She was wearing gloves! I froze all over. "I have a present for you," she said, still staring at me, still smiling, still showing her teeth and gums. I didn't answer. "Come down out of that tree, little boy, and I shall give you the most exciting present you've ever had." Her voice had a curious rasping quality, made a sort of metallic sound as though her throat was full of drawing pins. Without taking her eyes from my face, she very slowly put one of the gloved hands into her purse and drew out a small green snake. She held it up for me to see. "It's tame," she said. The snake began to coil itself around her forearm. It was brilliant green. "If you come down here, I shall give him to you." "Oh, Grandmama," I thought, "come and help me." Then I panicked. I dropped the hammer and shot up that enormous tree like a monkey. I didn't stop until I was as high as I could possibly go. I stayed up there for hours, and I kept very still. It began to grow dark. At last I heard my grandmother calling my name. "I'm up here!" I shouted back. "Come down at once! It's past your supper time!" "Grandmama!" I shouted. "Has that woman gone?" "What woman?" "The woman in the black gloves." There was silence from below. It was the silence of somebody who was too stunned to speak. "Grandmama!" I shouted again. "Has she gone?" "Yes," my grandmother answered at last. "She's gone. I'm here, my darling. You can come down now." I climbed down. I was trembling. My grandmother enfolded me in her arms. "I've seen a witch," I said. "Come inside," she said. "You'll be all right with me." She led me into the house and gave me a cup of hot cocoa with lots of sugar in it. "Tell me everything," she said. I told her. "Do you think she could be after me specially?" I asked. "No," she said, "I doubt that. One child is as good as any other to those creatures." It is hardly surprising that after that I became a very witch-conscious little boy. If I happened to be alone on the road and saw a woman approaching who was wearing gloves, I would quickly skip across to the other side. And as the weather remained pretty cold during the whole of that month, nearly everybody was wearing gloves. Curiously enough, though, I never saw the woman with the green snake again. That was my first witch, but it wasn't my last. The Easter holidays came and went, and the summer term began again at school. My grandmother and I already planned to take our summer holiday in Norway, and we talked about almost nothing else every evening. But when there were only 3 weeks of the summer term left, an awful thing happened. My grandmother got pneumonia. She became very ill, and a trained nurse moved into the house to look after her. The doctor explained to me that pneumonia is not normally a dangerous illness nowadays because of penicillin, but when a person is more than 80 years old, as my grandmother was, then it is very dangerous indeed. He said he didn't even dare to move her to hospital in her condition, so she stayed in her bedroom, and I hung about outside the door. "Can I go in and see her?" I asked.
"No, dear," the nurse said. "Not at the moment." A fat and jolly lady called Mrs. Spring, who used to come and clean our house every day, also moved in and slept in the house. I liked her very much, but she wasn't a patch on my grandmother for telling stories. One evening, about 10 days later, the doctor came downstairs and said to me, "You can go in and see her now, but only for a short time. She's been asking for you." I flew up the stairs and burst into my grandmother's room and threw myself into her arms. "Hey there," the nurse said. "Be careful with her." "Will you be all right now, Grandmamma?" I asked.
"The worst is over. I'll soon be up again."
"Will she?" I said to the nurse. "Oh, yes," the nurse answered, smiling. I gave her another hug.
"They won't let me have a cigar," she said.
"She's a tough old bird," the nurse said. "We'll have her up in another week." The nurse was right. Within a week, my grandmother was thumping around the house and interfering with Mrs. Spring's cooking.
"I thank you for all your help, Mrs. Spring," she said, "but you can go home now."
"Oh, no, I can't," Mrs. Spring said. "Doctor told me to see that you take it easy for the next few days." The doctor said more than that. He dropped a bombshell on my grandmother and me by telling us that on no account were we to risk the journey to Norway this summer.
"Rubbish," my grandmother said. "I've promised him we'll go."
"It's too far," the doctor said. "It would be very dangerous. I'll tell you what you can do. You can take your grandson to a nice hotel on the south coast of England instead. The sea air is just what you need."
"Oh, no," I said.
"Do you want your grandmother to die?" the doctor asked me.
"Never,"
I said. "Then don't let her go on a long journey this summer. She's not yet strong enough. And stop her smoking those vile black cigars." In the end, the doctor had his way about the holiday, but not about the cigars. Rooms were booked for us in a place called the Hotel Magnificent in the famous seaside town of Bournemouth. Soon after that, my grandmother and I took the train and settled into the hotel. It was an enormous white building on the seafront, and it looked to me like a pretty boring place to spend a summer holiday in. I had my own separate bedroom, but there was a door connecting my room with my grandmother's room so that we could visit each other without going into the corridor. Just before we left for Bournemouth, my grandmother had given me, as consolation, a present of 2 white mice in a little cage, and of course I took them with me. I called them William and Mary, and in the hotel I set out right away, teaching them to do tricks. On the very first morning after our arrival, the chambermaid was making my bed when one of my mice poked its head out from under the sheets. The maid let out a shriek that brought a dozen people running to see who was being murdered. I was reported to the manager. There followed an unpleasant scene in the manager's office, with the manager, my grandmother, and me. The manager, whose name was Mr. Stringer, was a bristly man in a black tailcoat.
"I cannot permit mice in my hotel, madam." "How dare you say that when your rotten hotel is full of rats, anyway?" my grandmother cried.
"Rats?" cried Mr. Stringer, going mauve in the face. "There are no rats in this hotel."
"I saw one this very morning," my grandmother said. "It was running down the corridor into the kitchen."
"That is not true," cried Mr. Stringer.
"You had better get the rat catcher in at once," my grandmother said, "before I report you to the public health authorities. I expect there's rats scuttling all over the kitchen floor and stealing the food off the shelves and jumping in and out of the soup. If you're not careful, the health people will be ordering the entire hotel to be closed before everyone gets typhoid fever."
"You're not being serious, madam."
"I was never more serious in my life," my grandmother said. Are you or are you not going to allow my grandson to keep his white mice in this room?"
The manager knew when he was beaten. "May I suggest a compromise, madam?" he said. "I will permit him to keep them in his room as long as they are never allowed out of the cage. How's that?"
"That will suit us very well,"
my grandmother said, and she stood up and marched out of the room with me behind her. There is no way you can train mice inside a cage. Yet I dared not let them out, because the chambermaid was spying on me all the time. I decided to seek a safer place where I could carry on with the training. There must surely be an empty room in this enormous hotel.
I put one mouse into each trouser pocket and wandered downstairs in search of a secret spot. The ground floor of the hotel was a maze of public rooms, all of them named in gold letters on the doors. None of them was empty. I went down a long, wide corridor, and at the end of it I came to the ballroom. The notice on the board said, RSPCC meeting, strictly private. This room is reserved for the annual meeting of the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. The double doors into the room were open. I peeped in. It was a colossal room. There were rows and rows of chairs, all facing a platform, but there was not a soul in sight. I sidled cautiously into the room. What a lovely, secret, silent place it was. The meeting of the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children must have taken place earlier in the day, and now they'd all gone home. Even if they hadn't, even if they did suddenly come pouring in, they would be wonderful, kind people who would look with favour upon a young mouse trainer going about his business. At the back of the room there was a large folding screen with Chinese dragons painted on it. I tiptoed to the back of the room and settled myself on the thick green carpet behind the big screen. What a splendid place this was, ideal for mouse training. I took William and Mary out of my trouser pockets. They sat beside me on the carpet, quiet and well-behaved. The trick I was going to teach them today was tightrope walking. It is not all that difficult to train an intelligent mouse. First you must have a piece of string. I had that. Then you must have some good cake. I had brought with me a rock cake, which I had pocketed while having tea with Grandmama the day before. Now here's what you do. You stretch the string tight between your two hands, but you start by keeping it very short, only about 3 inches. You put the mouse on your right hand and a little piece of cake on your left hand. The mouse is therefore only 3 inches away from the cake. He can see it and he can smell it. His whiskers twitch with excitement. He only has to take 2 steps along the string to reach this tasty morsel. He ventures forward. If the mouse has a good sense of balance, and most of them have, he will get across easily. I started with William. He walked the string without a moment's hesitation. I let him have a quick nibble of the cake, just to whet his appetite. Then I put him back on my right hand. This time I lengthened the string. William knew what to do now. Quite soon, William was walking a 24-inch tightrope, or rather tight string, from one hand to the other to reach the cake. It was wonderful to watch him. Now it was Mary's turn. I put William on the carpet beside me and rewarded him with some extra crumbs and a currant. Then I started going through the same routine all over again with Mary. My blinding ambition, you see, my dream of dreams, was to become one day the owner of a white mouse circus. I was about halfway through Mary's training when suddenly I heard voices outside the ballroom door. The sound grew louder. I recognized the voice of the awful hotel manager, Mr. Stringer. Help, I thought. But thank heavens for the huge screen. I crouched behind it and peered through the crack between 2 of the folding sections. I could see the entire length and width of the ballroom without anyone seeing me.
"Well, ladies, I'm sure you will be quite comfortable in here," Mr. Stringer's voice was saying.
Then in through the double doors he marched, black tailcoat and all, spreading his arms wide as he ushered in a great flock of ladies.
"If there's anything we can do for you, do not hesitate to let me know. Tea will be served for all of you on the Sunshine Terrace after you've concluded your meeting."
With that he bowed and scraped himself out of the room as a vast herd of ladies from the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children came streaming in. They wore pretty clothes, and all of them had hats on their heads. In they came, talking their heads off. They began milling round and choosing their seats, and there was a whole lot of stuff like,
"Come and sit next to me, Millie, dear," and "Oh, hello, Beatrice, I haven't seen you since the last meeting. What an adorable dress you have on."
I decided to stay where I was and let them get on with their meeting, while I got on with my mouse training. But I watched them for a while longer through the crack in the screen, waiting for them to settle down. How many were there? I guessed about 200. There was a lady wearing a tiny green hat in the middle of the back row who kept scratching the nape of her neck. Had she known somebody was watching her from behind, I'm sure she would have been embarrassed. I wondered if she had dandruff. All of a sudden I noticed that the lady next to her was doing the same thing, and the next one, and the next.
The whole lot of them were doing it. Did they have fleas in their hair? Then the most astonishing thing happened. I saw one lady pushing her fingers up underneath the hair on her head, and the hair, the entire head of hair, lifted upwards all in one piece, and the hands slid underneath the hair and went on scratching. She was wearing a wig. She was also wearing gloves. I glanced swiftly around at the rest of the now-seated audience. Every one of them was wearing gloves. My blood turned to ice. I began to shake all over. I glanced frantically behind me for a back door to escape through. There wasn't one. Should I leap out from behind the screen and make a dash for the double doors? Those double doors were already closed, and I could see a woman standing in front of them. She was bending forward and fixing some sort of metal chain round the two door handles. Keep still, I told myself. No one has seen you yet. But one false move, one cough, one sneeze, one nose blow, one little sound of any sort, and it won't be just one witch that gets you. It'll be 200. At that point, I think I fainted. The whole thing was altogether too much for a small boy to cope with. But I don't believe I was out for more than a few seconds, and when I came to, I was lying on the carpet, and I was still, thank heavens, behind the screen. Rather shakily, I got to my knees and peered once again through the crack in the screen. All the women, or rather the witches, were now sitting motionless in their chairs and staring as though hypnotized at somebody who had suddenly appeared on the platform. That somebody was another woman. The first thing I noticed about this woman was her size. She was tiny, probably no more than 4.5 feet tall. She looked quite young, I guessed about 25 or 6. She was very pretty. She had on a rather stylish long black dress that reached right to the ground, and she wore black gloves that came up to her elbows. Unlike the others, she wasn't wearing a hat. She didn't look to me like a witch at all, but she couldn't possibly not be one. Otherwise, what on earth was she doing up there on the platform? And why, for heaven's sake, were all the other witches gazing at her with such a mixture of adoration, awe, and fear? Very slowly, the young lady on the platform raised her hands to her face. I saw her gloved fingers unhooking something behind her ears. And then she caught hold of her cheeks and lifted her face clean away. The whole of that pretty face came away in her hands. It was a mask. As she took off the mask, she turned sideways and placed it carefully upon a small table nearby. When she turned round again and faced us, I very nearly screamed out loud. That face of hers was the most frightful and frightening thing I have ever seen. Just looking at it gave me the shakes all over. It was so crumpled and wizened, so shrunken and shriveled. It looked as though it had been pickled in vinegar. It was a fearsome and ghastly sight. There was something terribly wrong with it, something foul and putrid and decayed. There are times when something is so frightful you become mesmerized by it and can't look away. I was like that now. I was transfixed. I knew immediately, of course, that this was none other than the Grand High Witch herself. I knew also why she had worn the mask. She could never have moved around in public, let alone book in at a hotel, with her real face. "The doors!" shouted the Grand High Witch in a voice that filled the room and bounced round the walls. "Are they chained and bolted?" "The doors are chained and bolted, your grandness," answered a voice in the audience. The brilliant snake's eyes that were set so deep in that dreadful, rotting, worm-eaten face glared unblinkingly at the witches who sat facing her. "You may remove your gloves," she shouted. Her voice, I noticed, had that same hard, metallic quality as the voice of the witch I had met under the conker tree. It rasped, it grated, it snarled. Everyone in the room was peeling off her gloves. I was watching the hands of those in the back row. I wanted very much to see what their fingers looked like and whether my grandmother had been right. Yes! I could see several of them now. I could see the brown claws curving over the tips of the fingers. They were about 2 inches long, those claws, and sharp at the ends. "You may remove your shoes."
I heard a sigh of relief going up from all the witches in the room as they kicked off their narrow, high-heeled shoes. Then I got a glimpse under the chairs of several pairs of stockinged feet, square and completely toeless. Revolting they were, as though the toes had been sliced away from the feet with a carving knife.
"You may remove your wigs,"
snarled the Grand High Witch. She had a peculiar way of speaking. There was some sort of foreign accent there, something harsh and guttural, and she seemed to have trouble pronouncing the letter W. As well as that, she did something funny with the letter R. She would roll it round and round her mouth like a piece of hot pork crackling before spitting it out.
"Remove your wigs and get some fresh air into your spotty scalps,"
she shouted. And another sigh of relief arose from the audience as all the hands went up to the heads and all the wigs with hats still on them were lifted away. There now appeared in front of me row upon row of bald female heads, a sea of naked scalps, every one of them red and itchy-looking from being rubbed by the linings of the wigs. I simply cannot tell you how awful they were. It was monstrous. Oh, heavens, I thought. Oh, help! Oh, Lord, have mercy on me. These foul, bald-headed females are child killers, every one of them, and here I am imprisoned in the same room, and I can't escape. At that point, a new and doubly horrifying thought struck me. My grandmother had said that with their special nose holes, they could smell out a child on a pitch-black night from right across the other side of the road. Up to now, my grandmother had been right every time. It seemed a certainty, therefore, that one of the witches in the back row was going to sniff me out at any moment. I knelt on the carpet behind the screen, hardly daring to breathe. Then suddenly I remembered another very important thing my grandmother had told me.
"The dirtier you are," she had said, "the harder it is for a witch to smell you out."
How long since I had last had a bath? Not for ages. I don't believe I'd had a bath since we arrived. When had I last washed my hands or face? Certainly not this morning. Not yesterday either. I glanced down at my hands. They were covered with smudge and mud, and goodness knows what else besides. So perhaps I had a chance, after all.
"Witches of England!"
shouted the Grand High Witch. She herself, I noticed, had not taken off either her wig or her gloves or her shoes.
"Witches of England!" she yelled.
The audience stirred uneasily and sat up straighter in their chairs.
"Miserable witches!" she yelled. "Useless, lazy witches! You are a heap of idle, good-for-nothing worms!"
A shudder went through the audience. The Grand High Witch was clearly in an ugly mood, and they knew it.
"I am having my breakfast this morning,"
cried the Grand High Witch,
"and I am looking out of the window at the beach, and what am I seeing? I am asking you, what am I seeing? I am seeing a revolting sight. I am seeing hundreds. I am seeing thousands of rotten, repulsive little children playing on the sand. It is putting me right off my food. Why have you not got rid of them? Why have you not rubbed them out? These filthy, smelly children!"
With each word she spoke, flecks of pale blue phlegm shot from her mouth like little bullets.
"I am asking you why!"
Nobody answered her question.
"Children smell. They stink out the world. We do not want these children around here. One child a week is no good to me." "We will do better," murmured the audience. "We will do much better." "Better is no good either!"
shrieked the Grand High Witch.
"I demand maximum results. So here are my orders. My orders are that every single child in this country shall be rubbed out, squashed, squirted, skivitted, and frittered before I come here again in 1 year's time. Do I make myself clear?
A great gasp went up from the audience. I saw the witches all looking at one another with deeply troubled expressions, and I heard one witch at the end of the front row saying aloud,
All of them? We can't possibly wipe out all of them.
The Grand High Witch whipped round as though someone had stuck a skewer into her bottom.
Who said that? Who dares to argue with me? It was you, was it not?
She pointed a gloved finger as sharp as a needle at the witch who had spoken.
I didn't mean it, your greatness,
the witch cried out.
You dared to argue with me! I was just talking to myself,
cried the wretched witch. The Grand High Witch took a quick step forward, and when she spoke again, it was in a voice that made my blood run cold.
A stupid witch who answers back must burn until her bones are black.
No, no, begged the witch in the front row. The Grand High Witch went on.
A foolish witch without a brain must sizzle in the fiery flame. Save me!
cried the wretched witch in the front row. A moment later, a stream of sparks that looked like tiny, white-hot metal filings came shooting out of the Grand High Witch's eyes and flew straight towards the one that had dared to speak. I saw the sparks striking against her and burrowing into her, and she screamed a horrible, howling scream, and a puff of smoke rose up around her. A smell of burning meat filled the room. Nobody moved. Like me, they were all watching the smoke, and when it had cleared away, the chair was empty. I caught a glimpse of something wispy white, like a little cloud, fluttering upwards and disappearing out of the window. A great sigh rose up from the audience. The Grand High Witch glared around the room.
I hope nobody else is going to make me cross today.
There was a deathly silence.
Now we can get down to business. Children are revolting,
screamed the Grand High Witch.
We will scrub them off the face of the earth. Yes, yes,
chanted the audience.
Scrub them off the earth. Children are smelling of dogs' droppings,
screeched the Grand High Witch.
Pooh, cried the audience. Pooh, pooh, pooh.
So now, barked the Grand High Witch,
so now I am having a plan for getting rid of every single child in the whole of England. Listen very carefully, and let us not be having any muck-ups.
The audience leaned forward.
Each and every one of you, thundered the Grand High Witch, is to go back to your hometowns immediately and resign from your jobs. Resign! Give notice! Retire! We will resign from our jobs. And after you have resigned from your jobs, each and every one of you will be going out and you will be buying.
She paused.
What will we be buying? They cried. Tell us, O brilliant one. What is it we shall be buying? Sweet shops,
shouted the Grand High Witch.
Sweet shops, they cried. We're going to buy sweet shops. What a frumptuous wheeze. You will be buying the very best and most respectable sweet shops in England. I am wanting no tuppenny, hipney, crummy little tobacco-selling newspaper sweet shops, shouted the Grand High Witch. I am wanting you to get only the very best shops filled up high with piles and piles of luscious sweets and tasty chocks. You will be having no trouble in getting what you want, shouted the Grand High Witch, because you will be offering 4 times as much as a shop is worth, and nobody is refusing an offer like that. Money is not a problem to us witches, as you know very well. I have brought with me 6 trunks stuffed full of English banknotes, all new and crisp. And all of them, she added with a fiendish leer, all of them homemade.
The witches in the audience grinned. The Grand High Witch grated her bony-gloved hands against each other and cried out,
So, each of you is owning a magnificent sweet shop. The next move is that each of you will be announcing in the window of your shop that on a certain day you will be having a great gala opening with free sweets and chocks to every child. That will bring them in, the greedy little brutes, cried the audience. Next, continued the Grand High Witch, you will prepare yourselves for this great gala opening by filling every choc and every sweet in your shop with my very latest and greatest magic formula. This is known as Formula 86 Delayed Action Mouse Maker. Delayed Action Mouse Maker, they chanted. Her grandness has concocted yet another of her wondrous magic child killers. How do we make it, oh brilliant one? Delayed Action Mouse Maker is a green liquid, explained the Grand High Witch, and 1 droplet in every choc or sweet will be quite enough. So here is what happens. Child eats choc which has in it Delayed Action Mouse Maker liquid. Child goes home feeling fine. Child goes to bed still feeling fine. Child wakes up in the morning still okay. Child goes to school still feeling fine. Formula, you understand, is delayed action and is not working yet. But when does it start working? It is starting to work at exactly 9 o'clock when the child is arriving at school, shouted the Grand High Witch triumphantly. Child arrives at school, Delayed Action Mouse Maker immediately starts to work. Child starts to shrink. Child is starting to grow fur. Child is starting to grow tail. All is happening in precisely 26 seconds. After 26 seconds, child is not a child any longer. It is a mouse. A mouse! What a frumpious thought. Classrooms will all be swarming with mice. And what, shouted the Grand High Witch, is happening next in every school? Tell us, oh brainy one.
The Grand High Witch stretched her stringy neck forward and grinned at the audience.
Mouse traps is coming out. Mouse traps, cried the witches. And cheese, shouted the Grand High Witch. All over England, in every school in England, noise of snapping mouse traps will be heard.
At this point, the disgusting old Grand High Witch began to do a sort of witch's dance up and down the platform, stamping her feet and clapping her hands. The entire audience joined in the clapping and the foot-stamping. Then, above all the noise, I heard the voice of the Grand High Witch screaming out some sort of an awful, gloating song.
Down with children, do them in, boil their bones and fry their skin. Bish them, squish them, bash them, mash them, break them, shake them, slash them, smash them. Offer chocks with magic powder, say eat up, then say it louder. Cram them full of sticky eats, send them home still guzzling sweets. And in the morning, little fools go marching off to separate schools. A girl feels sick and goes all pale. She yells, hey look, I've grown a tail. A boy who's standing next to her screams, help, I think I'm growing fur. Another shouts, we look like freaks. And all at once, all in a trice, there are no children, only mice. And all the poor demented teachers is yelling, hey, who are these creatures? They stand upon their desks and shout, get out, you filthy mouse, get out! Will someone fetch some mouse traps, please? And don't forget to bring the cheese. Now mouse traps come and every trap goes snippy snap and snappy snap. There are mice every place around, piled 2 feet deep upon the ground. The teachers cry, what's going on? Oh, where have all the children gone? It's 9:30 and as a rule, they are never late as this for school. Poor teachers don't know what to do. Some sit and read, and just a few amuse themselves throughout the day by sweeping all the mice away. And all us witches shout, hooray!
I hope you haven't forgotten that while all this was going on, I was still stuck behind the screen on my hands and knees with one eye glued to the crack. And all the way through, I was living in constant terror that one of the witches in the back row was going to get a whiff of my presence. The Grand High Witch's dreadful, gloating song was over now, and the audience was clapping madly and shouting,
Brilliant, sensational, you are a genius, oh brainy one. It's a thrilling invention, it's a winner. We shall never be caught. Witches are never caught, snapped the Grand High Witch. Attention now! I want everybody's attention, for I am about to tell you what you must do to prepare Formula 86 Delayed Action Mouse Maker.
Suddenly there came a great gasp from the audience. This was followed by a hubbub of shrieking and yelling, and I saw many of the witches leaping to their feet and pointing at the platform and crying out,
Mice! 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 She's done it to show us the brainy one has turned 2 children into mice, and here they are.
I looked toward the platform. The mice were there, all right, 2 of them, running around near the Grand High Witch's skirts. But these were not field mice or house mice or wood mice or harvest mice. They were white mice. I recognized them immediately as being my own little William and Mary.
Mice!
Shouted the audience.
Our leader has made mice to appear out of nowhere.
I saw the Grand High Witch peering down at the floor and staring with obvious puzzlement at William and Mary. She bent lower to get a close look. Then she straightened up and shouted,
Quiet!
The audience became silent and sat down.
These mice are nothing to do with me, she shouted. These mice are pet mice. These mice are quite obviously belonging to some repellent little child in the hotel. A boy, it will be for a certainty, because girls are not keeping pet mice. A boy? Cried the witches. A filthy, smelly little boy. We'll swipe him. We'll swizzle him. We'll have his stripes for breakfast. Silence! Whoever he is not important. Leave him to me. I shall smell him out and turn him into a mackerel and have him dished up for supper. Bravo! Cut off his head and chop off his tail and fry him in hot butter.
You can imagine that none of this was making me feel very comfortable. William and Mary were still running around on the platform, and I saw the Grand High Witch aim a swift running kick at William. She caught him right on the point of her toe and sent him flying. She did the same to Mary. Her aim was extraordinary. She would have made a great football player. Both mice crashed against the wall, and for a few moments they lay stunned. Then they got to their feet and scampered away.
"Attention again!" the Grand High Witch was shouting. "I will now give you the recipe for concocting Formula 86 Delayed Action Mouse Maker. Get out pencils and paper."
Handbags were opened all over the room, and notebooks were fished out.
"First, I had to find something that would cause the children to become very small very quickly." "And what was that?" "That part was simple. All you have to do if you are wishing to make a child very small is to look at him through the wrong end of a telescope. So you take the wrong end of a telescope and you boil it until it gets soft." "How long does that take?" 21 hours. And while this is going on, you take exactly 45 brown mice and you chop off their tails with a carving knife and you fry the tails in hair oil until they are nice and crisp. Then you simmer them in frog juice for 1 hour. But listen to me. So far, I have only given you the easy part of the recipe. The really difficult problem is to put in something that will have a genuine delayed action result. Something that can be eaten by children on a certain day, but which will not start working on them until 9 o'clock the next morning when they arrive at school. "What did you come up with, oh brainy one?" they called out. "Tell us the great secret." "The secret," announced the Grand High Witch triumphantly, "is an alarm clock." "An alarm clock? It's a stroke of genius." "Of course it is," said the Grand High Witch. "You can set a 24-hour alarm clock today, and at exactly 9 o'clock tomorrow it will go off." "But we will need 5 million alarm clocks," cried the audience. "We will need one for each child." "Idiots! If you are wanting a steak, you do not cook the whole cow. It is the same with alarm clocks. 1 clock will make enough for 1,000 children. Here is what you do. You set your alarm clock to go off at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Then you roast it in the oven until it is crisp and tender. Next, you take your boiled telescope and your fried mouse tails and your cooked mice and your roasted alarm clock, and all together you put them into the mixer. Then you mix them at full speed. This will give you a nice, thick paste. While the mixer is still mixing, you must add to it the yolk of 1 Gruntel's egg. You mix in the egg, and one after the other you also mix in the following items: the claw of a crab cruncher, the beak of a blabber snitch, the snout of a grubble skirt, and the tongue of a catch springer. When you have mixed everything together in the mixer, you will have a most marvelous-looking green liquid. Put 1 drop, just 1 titchy droplet of this liquid into a chocolate or a sweet, and at 9 o'clock the next morning, the child who ate it will turn into a mouse in 26 seconds. But 1 word of warning. Never increase the dose. Never put more than 1 drop into each sweet or chocolate. And never give more than 1 sweet or chocolate to each child. An overdose of delayed action mouse maker will mess up the timing of the alarm clock and cause the child to turn into a mouse too early. A large overdose might even have an instant effect, and you wouldn't want that, would you? That would give the game away. I am now going to prove to you that this recipe is working to perfection. Yesterday, I personally am preparing a small quantity of the magic formula in order to give you a public demonstration. But I am making 1 small change in the recipe.
Before I am roasting the alarm clock, I am setting it to go off not at 9 o'clock the next morning, but at 3:30 the next afternoon. Which means 3:30 this afternoon. And that, she said, glancing at her wristwatch, is in precisely 7 minutes' time. The audience of witches was listening intently. So what am I doing yesterday with this magic liquid? I will tell you what I am doing. I am putting 1 droplet of it into a very squishy chocolate bar, and I am giving this bar to a repulsively smelly little boy who is hanging round the lobby of the hotel.
The Grand High Witch paused.
I said to him, "Would you like some more?" And he said, "Yes." So I said, "I will give you 6 more chocolate bars like that if you will meet me in the ballroom of this hotel at 3:25 tomorrow afternoon." 6 bars, cried this greedy little swine. "You bet I'll be there." It is now exactly 25 minutes past 3, and the nasty little stinker who will be turning into a mouse in 5 minutes' time should at this very moment be standing outside the doors.
And by gum, she was absolutely right. The boy, whoever he might be, was already rattling the door handle and banging on the doors with his fist.
"Quick!"
shrieked the Grand High Witch.
"Put on your wigs! Put on your gloves! Put on your shoes!"
There was a great rustle and bustle of putting on wigs and gloves and shoes, and I saw the Grand High Witch herself reach for her face mask and put it on over that revolting face of hers. It was astonishing how that mask transformed her. All of a sudden, she became once again a rather pretty young lady.
"Let me in!" came the boy's voice. "Where are those chocolate bars you promised me? I'm here to collect. Dish them out." "He is not only smelly, he is also greedy," said the Grand High Witch. "Let him come in."
One of the witches leapt to her feet and unfastened the chains. She opened the 2 huge doors. A small boy, wearing a white T-shirt and grey shorts and gym shoes, entered the room. I recognized him at once. He was called Bruno Jenkins, and he was staying in the hotel with his parents. I didn't care for him. He was one of those boys who's always eating something whenever you meet him. What's more, Bruno never stopped boasting about how his father made more money than my father, and that they owned 3 cars. But worse than that, yesterday morning I had found him kneeling on the flagstones of the hotel terrace with a magnifying glass in his hand. There was a column of ants marching across one of the flagstones, and Bruno Jenkins was focusing the sun through his magnifying glass and roasting the ants, one by one.
"I like watching them burn," he said. "That's horrible," I cried. "Stop doing it." "Let's see you stop me," he said.
At that point, I had pushed him with all my might, and he had crashed sideways onto the flagstones. His magnifying glass had splintered into many pieces, and he had leapt up, shrieking,
"My father's going to get you for this!"
I doubted very much that he was about to be turned into a mouse, though I must confess that I was secretly hoping it might happen. Either way, I didn't envy him being up there in front of all those witches.
"Darling boy," cooed the Grand High Witch from up on the platform, "I have your chocolates all ready for you."
Her voice was quite different now. It was soft and gentle. Bruno was looking a bit bewildered, but he allowed himself to be led up onto the platform.
"Okay, where are my 6 bars of chocolate?"
I saw the witch who had let him in quietly putting the chain back on the door handles.
"The time is now 1 minute before 3:30,
announced the Grand High Witch. "What the heck's going on?" Bruno asked. He wasn't frightened, but he wasn't looking exactly comfortable either. "What is this? Give me my chocolate."
30 seconds to go,"
cried the Grand High Witch, gripping Bruno by the arm. Bruno shook himself clear and stared at her. She stared back at him, smiling with the lips of her mask. Every witch in the audience was staring at Bruno.
20 seconds.
"Give me the chocolate," shouted Bruno, becoming suddenly suspicious. "Give me the chocolate and let me out of here."
15 seconds.
"Will one of you crazy punks kindly tell me what all this is about?" shouted Bruno.
10 seconds, cried the Grand High Witch. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have ignition!
I could have sworn I heard an alarm clock ringing. I saw Bruno jump. He jumped as though someone had stuck a hat-pin deep into his bottom, and he yelled, "Ow!" He jumped so high that he landed on a small table up there on the stage, and he started hopping about on the top of this table, waving his arms and yelling his head off. Then suddenly he became silent. His whole body stiffened.
"The alarm has gone off!" shrieked the Grand High Witch. "The mouse maker is beginning to work!"
She started hopping about on the platform and clapping her gloved hands together. Bruno was getting smaller by the second. I could see him shrinking. Now his clothes seemed to be disappearing, and brown fur was growing all over his body. Suddenly he had a tail. Then he had whiskers. Now he had 4 feet. It was all happening so quickly. It was a matter of seconds only. And all at once he wasn't there any more. A small brown mouse was running around on the tabletop.
"Bravo!"
yelled the audience.
"She's done it! It works! You are a miracle, you brainy one!"
They were all standing up and clapping and cheering, and the Grand High Witch produced a mousetrap from the folds of her dress and started to set it. Oh, no, I thought, I don't want to see this. Bruno Jenkins may have been a bit of a stinker, but I'm dashed if I want to watch him having his head chopped off.
"Where is he?"
snapped the Grand High Witch, searching the platform.
"Where has that mouse got to?"
She couldn't find him. Clever Bruno must have jumped down off the table and scampered off it into some corner, or even down a small hole. Thank heavens for that.
"It matters not,"
shouted the Grand High Witch.
"Silence and sit down."
The Grand High Witch stood on the very centre of the platform, and those dangerous eyes of hers travelled slowly around the audience of witches who were sitting so meekly before her.
"All those over 70, put up your hands,"
she barked suddenly. 7 or 8 hands went up in the air.
"It comes to me," said the Grand High Witch, "that you ancient ones will not be able to climb high trees in search of Gruntle's eggs." "We won't, your greatness,"
chanted the ancient ones.
"Nor will you be able to catch the crab cruncher who lives high up on the rocky cliffs. I can't exactly see you sprinting after the speedy catch-springer, either. You are too old and feeble for those things." "We are," chanted the ancient ones. "We are. You ancient ones have served me well over many years," said the Grand High Witch, "and I do not wish to deny you the pleasure of bumping off a few thousand children each just because you have become old and feeble. I have therefore prepared personally, with my own hands, a limited quantity of delayed action mouse maker, which I will distribute to the ancient ones before you leave the hotel." "Oh, thank you, cried the old witches. "Here is a sample of what I am giving you,"
shouted the Grand High Witch. She fished around in a pocket of her dress and brought out a very small bottle.
"In this tiny bottle is enough to turn 500 children into mice. Each of you ancient ones will get 2 of these bottles." "Thank you. "Our meeting is over," announced the Grand High Witch. "Here is the timetable for the remainder of your stay in this hotel. Right now, we must all go out onto the Sunshine Terrace and have tea with that ridiculous manager. Next, at 6 o'clock tonight, those witches who are too old to climb trees after Gruntle's eggs will report to my room to receive 2 bottles each of mouse maker. My room number is 454. Do not forget it. Then, at 8 o'clock, all of you will assemble in the dining room for supper. We are the lovely ladies of the RSPCC, and they are setting up 2 long tables specially for us. But do not forget to put the cotton plugs up your noses. That dining room will be full of filthy little children, and without the nose plugs, the stink will be unbearable. Any questions?" "I have one question, your grandness,"
said a voice in the audience.
What happens if one of the chocolates we're giving away in our shops gets eaten by a grown-up? That's just too bad for the grown-up, said the Grand High Witch. This meeting is over. Out you go.
The witches stood up and began gathering their things together.
Wait!
Shrieked one of the witches in the back row.
Hold everything!
Her shrieking voice echoed through the ballroom like a trumpet. All the witches suddenly stopped and turned and looked toward the speaker.
What is it?
The others cried out.
Dogs' droppings! She yelled. Just then, I got a whiff of dogs' droppings. There it is again. It's not strong, but it's here. It's definitely somewhere not too far away. What's going on down there?
Shouted the Grand High Witch, glaring down from the platform.
Mildred's just got a whiff of dogs' droppings, your grandness.
What rubbish is this? Shouted the Grand High Witch. She has dogs' droppings on the brain. There are no children in this room.
Hang on,
cried the witch called Mildred.
I'm getting it again.
All the noses of all the witches in that room went up in the air, and all the nostrils began to suck and sniff.
She's right,
cried another voice.
She's absolutely right. Dogs' droppings it is, strong and foul.
In a matter of seconds, the entire assembly of witches had taken up the dreaded cry of dogs' droppings.
Dogs' droppings,
they shouted.
The room is full of it. Pooh, pooh. Find it,
screamed the Grand High Witch.
Track it down. Rootle it out.
The hairs of my head were standing up like the bristles of a nail brush.
Rootle it out. If it is in here, it has observed the most secret things. It must be exterminated immediately.
I remember thinking to myself, there is no escape for me now. The doors are chained and locked. I'm done for. Oh, Grandmamma, what are they going to do to me? I looked round and I saw a hideous painted and powdered witch's face staring down at me, and the face opened its mouth and yelled triumphantly,
It's here. It's behind the screen. Come and get it.
The witch reached out a gloved hand and grabbed me by the hair, but I twisted free and jumped away. I ran. Oh, how I ran! The sheer terror of it all put wings on my feet. I flew around the outside of the great ballroom, and not one of them had a chance of catching me. As I came level with the doors, I paused and tried to open them, but the big chain was on them, and they didn't even rattle. The witches were not bothering to chase me. They simply stood there in small groups, watching me, and knowing for certain that there was no way I could escape.
Catch it then, you idiots!
Screamed the Grand High Witch from up on the platform.
Spread out in a line across the room and close in on it.
The witches spread out as they were told. They advanced towards me, some from one end, some from the other, and some came down the middle between the rows of empty chairs. They were bound to get me now. For sheer and absolute terror, I began to scream, "Help!" I screamed, "Help! Help! Help!"
"Get it!"
shouted the Grand High Witch. "Stop it yelling!" They rushed at me then, and about 5 of them grabbed me by the arms and legs and lifted me clear off the ground. I went on screaming, but one of them clapped a gloved hand over my mouth, and that stopped me.
"Bring it here!" shouted the Grand High Witch. "Bring the spying little worm up here to me!"
I was carried onto the platform with my arms and legs held tight by many hands, and I lay there suspended in the air, facing the ceiling. I saw the Grand High Witch standing over me, grinning at me in the most horrible way. She held up the small blue bottle of mouse-maker, and she said, "Now for a little medicine. Hold his nose to make him open his mouth." Strong fingers pinched my nose. I kept my mouth closed tight and held my breath, but I couldn't do it for long. My chest was bursting. I opened my mouth to get one big, quick breath of air,
and as I did so, the Grand High Witch poured the entire contents of the little bottle down my throat. Oh, the pain and the fire! My throat was going up in flames. Then very quickly the frightful burning, searing, scorching feelings started, spreading down into my chest and into my tummy and on, into my arms and legs and all over my body. I screamed and screamed, but once again the gloved hand was clapped over my lips. The next thing I felt was my skin beginning to tighten. How else can I describe it? I felt as though I was a balloon and somebody was twisting the top of the balloon and twisting, and the balloon was getting smaller and smaller, and the skin was getting tighter, and soon it was going to burst. Then the squeezing began. This time I was inside a suit of iron, and somebody was turning a screw. After that there came a fierce prickling sensation all over my skin, as though tiny needles were forcing their way out. Far away in the distance I heard the voice of the Grand High Witch yelling, 500 doses! This stinking little carbuncle has had 500 doses, and the alarm clock has been smashed, and now we are having instantaneous action. I heard clapping and cheering, and I remember thinking, I'm not myself any longer. I've gone clear out of my own skin. I noticed that the floor was only an inch from my nose. I noticed also a pair of little furry front paws resting on the floor. I was able to move those paws. They were mine. At that moment, I realized that I was not a little boy any longer. I was a mouse.
Now for the mouse trap! I heard the Grand High Witch yelling. I've got it right here! And here's a piece of cheese.
But I wasn't going to wait for that. I was off across the platform like a streak of lightning. I was astonished at my own speed. I leapt over Witch's feet, right and left, and in no time at all I was down the steps and onto the floor of the ballroom itself and skittering off among the rows of chairs. What I especially liked was the fact that I made no sound at all as I ran. I was a swift and silent mover, and quite amazingly, the pain had all gone now. I was feeling quite remarkably well. It is not a bad thing after all, I thought to myself, to be tiny as well as speedy when there is a bunch of dangerous females after your blood. I selected the back leg of a chair and squeezed up against it and kept very still. In the distance, the Grand High Witch was shouting,
Leave the little stinkpot alone! It is not worth bothering about. It is only a mouse now. Let us get out of here. The meeting is over. Unlock the doors and shove off to the Sunshine Terrace to have tea with that idiotic manager.
I peeped round the leg of the chair and watched the hundreds of witches' feet walking out through the doors of the ballroom. When they'd all gone, the place was absolutely silent. I began to move cautiously about on the floor. Suddenly I remembered Bruno. He must surely be around here somewhere too. Bruno! I called out. I wasn't seriously expecting that I would be able to speak at all now that I'd become a mouse, so I got the shock of my life when I heard my own voice. My own perfectly normal, rather loud voice coming out of my tiny mouth. It was wonderful. I was thrilled. I tried it again. Bruno Jenkins, where are you? I called out. If you can hear me, give a shout. My voice was exactly the same and just as loud as it had been when I was a boy. Hey there, Bruno Jenkins, I called. Where are you? There was no answer. I pottered about between the seat legs, trying to get used to being so close to the ground. I decided I rather liked it. You're probably wondering why I wasn't depressed at all. I found myself thinking, what's so wonderful about being a little boy, anyway? Why is that necessarily any better than being a mouse? I know that mice get hunted, and they sometimes get poisoned or caught in traps, but little boys sometimes get killed, too. Little boys can be run over by motor cars, or they can die of some awful illness. Little boys have to go to school. Mice don't. Mice don't have to pass exams. Mice don't have to worry about money. Mice, as far as I can see, have only two enemies, humans and cats. My grandmother is a human, but I know for certain that she will always love me, whoever I am. And she never, thank goodness, keeps a cat. When mice grow up, they don't ever have to go to war and fight against other mice. Mice, I felt pretty certain, all like each other. People don't. Yes, I told myself, I don't think it is at all a bad thing to be a mouse. I was wandering around the ballroom floor, thinking about all this, when I spotted another mouse. It was crouching on the floor, holding a piece of bread in its front paws, and nibbling away at it. It had to be Bruno. Hello, Bruno, I said.
He glanced up at me for about 2 seconds, then went right on guzzling. "What have you found?" I asked him. "One of them dropped it. It's a fish paste sandwich, pretty good." He, too, spoke with a perfectly normal voice. One would have expected that a mouse, if it was going to talk at all, would do so with the smallest and squeakiest voice you could imagine. It was terrifically funny to hear the voice of the rather loud-mouthed Bruno coming out of that tiny mouse's throat. "Listen, Bruno," I said, "now that we're both mice, I think we ought to start thinking a bit about the future." He stopped eating and stared at me with small black eyes.
"What do you mean, we?" he said. "The fact that you're a mouse has nothing to do with me."
"But you're a mouse too, Bruno."
"Don't be a fool. I'm not a mouse."
"I'm afraid you are, Bruno."
"I most certainly am not," he shouted. "Why are you insulting me? Why do you call me a mouse?"
"Don't you know what's happened to you?" I said.
"What on earth are you talking about?"
"I have to inform you that not very long ago the witches turned you into a mouse. Then they did it to me."
"You're lying. I'm not a mouse."
"If you hadn't been so busy guzzling that sandwich, you would have noticed your hairy paws. Take a look at them." Bruno looked down at his paws. He jumped.
"Good grief," he cried. "I am a mouse. You wait till my father hears about this."
"He may think it's an improvement."
"I don't want to be a mouse," Bruno shouted, jumping up and down. "I refuse to be a mouse. I'm Bruno Jenkins."
"There are worse things than being a mouse," I said. "You can live in a hole."
"I don't want to live in a hole."
"And you can creep into the larder at night," I said, "and nibble through all the packets of raisins and cornflakes and chocolate biscuits and everything else you can find. You can stay there all night, eating yourself silly. That's what mice do."
"Now that's a thought," Bruno said, perking up a bit. "But how am I going to open the door of the fridge to get at the cold chicken and all the leftovers?"
"Maybe your rich father will get you a special little mouse fridge all to yourself," I said.
"You say a witch did this to me?" Bruno said. "Which witch?"
"The one who gave you the chocolate bar in the hotel lobby yesterday," I told him.
"The filthy old cow!" he shouted. "I'll get over this. Where is she? Who is she?"
"Forget it. You don't have a hope. Your biggest problem at the moment is your parents. How are they going to take this?" Bruno considered this for a moment. "I think that my father's going to be a bit put out." "And your mother?"
"She's terrified of mice."
"Then you've got a problem, haven't you?"
"Why only me?" he said. "What about you?"
"My grandmother will understand perfectly," I said. "She knows all about witches." Bruno took another bite of his sandwich.
"What do you suggest?"
"I suggest we both go first of all and consult my grandmother. She'll know exactly what to do." I moved towards the doors. "When we get into the corridor," I said, "we're going to run like mad. Stick close to the wall all the way and follow me. Here goes." Soon as I was out of the ballroom, I took off like a flash. I streaked down the corridor, went through the lounge and the reading room and the library and the drawing room, and came to the stairs. Up the stairs I went, jumping quite easily from one to the other, keeping well in against the wall all the time. "Are you with me, Bruno?" I whispered. "Right here," he said. My grandmother's room and my own were on the 5th floor. It was quite a climb, but we made it. On the 5th floor, I raced along the corridor to the door of my grandmother's room. A pair of her shoes was standing outside the door to be cleaned. Bruno was alongside me.
"What do we do now?"
he said. Suddenly I caught sight of a chambermaid coming along the corridor towards us. I saw at once that she was the one who had reported me to the manager for keeping white mice.
"Quick," I said to Bruno, "hide in one of those shoes."
I hopped into one shoe, and Bruno hopped into the other. I waited for the maid to walk past us. She didn't. When she came to the shoes, she bent down and picked them up. In doing this, she put her hand right inside the one I was hiding in. When one of her fingers touched me, I bit it. It was a silly thing to do, but I did it instinctively without thinking. The maid let out a scream that must have been heard by ships far out in the English Channel, and she dropped the shoes and ran like the wind. My grandmother's door opened.
"What on earth is going on out here?" she said.
I darted between her legs into her room, and Bruno followed me.
"Close the door, Grandmamma," I cried. "Please hurry."
She looked round and saw 2 small brown mice on the carpet.
"Please close it," I said.
And this time she actually saw me talking and recognized my voice. She froze and became absolutely motionless. Then she started to tremble. I thought she was going to faint and fall over.
"Please close the door quickly, Grandmamma," I said. "That awful maid might come in."
She somehow managed to gather herself together enough to close the door. I saw tears beginning to come out of her eyes. "Don't cry, Grandmamma," I said. "Things could be a lot worse. I did get away from them. I'm still alive. So is Bruno. Very slowly, she bent down and picked me up with one hand. Then she picked Bruno up with the other hand and put us both on the table. There was a bowl of bananas in the centre of the table, and Bruno jumped straight into it and began tearing away with his teeth at one of the banana skins to get at the fruit inside. My grandmother grasped the arm of her chair to steady herself, but her eyes never left me. "Sit down, dear grandmamma." She collapsed into her chair. "Oh, my darling," she murmured, and now the tears were really streaming down her cheeks. "What have they done to you?" "I know what they've done, grandmamma, and I know what I am, but the funny thing is that I don't honestly feel especially bad about it. I know I'm not a boy any longer, and I never will be again, but I'll be quite all right as long as there's always you to look after me." "Of course I'll look after you," my grandmother murmured. "Who is the other one?" "That was a boy called Bruno Jenkins," I told her. "They got him first." My grandmother took a new long black cigar out of a case in her handbag and put it in her mouth. Then she got a box of matches. She struck a match, but her fingers were shaking so much that the flame kept missing the end of the cigar. When she got it lit at last, she took a long pull and sucked in the smoke. "Where did it happen?" she whispered. "Where is the witch now? Is she in the hotel?" "Grandmamma," I said, "it wasn't just one, it was hundreds. They're all over the place. They're right here in the hotel this very moment." She leaned forward and stared at me. You don't actually mean to tell me they are holding the annual meeting right here in the hotel?" "They've held it, grandmamma. It's finished. I heard it all. And all of them, including the Grand High Witch herself, are downstairs now. They're pretending they're the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. They're all having tea with the manager." "And they caught you?" "They smelt me out," I said. "Dogs' droppings, was it?" she said, sighing. "I'm afraid so, but it wasn't strong. They very nearly didn't smell me because I hadn't had a bath for ages." "Children should never have baths," my grandmother said. "It's a dangerous habit." "I agree, grandmamma." She paused, sucking at her cigar. "Do you really mean to tell me that they are now all downstairs having tea?" she said. "I'm certain of it, grandmamma." There was another pause. I could see the old glint of excitement slowly coming back into my grandmother's eyes, and all of a sudden she sat up in her chair and said sharply, "Tell me everything, right from the beginning, and please hurry." I took a deep breath and began to talk. I told her about going to the ballroom and hiding behind the screen to do my mouse training. I told her all about the women coming in and sitting down, and about the small woman who appeared on the stage and took off her mask. But when it came to describing what her face looked like underneath the mask, I simply couldn't find the right words. "It was horrible, grandmamma," I said. "It was like something that was going rotten." "Go on," my grandmother said. "Don't stop." Then I told her about all the others taking off their wigs and their gloves and their shoes, and how I saw before me a sea of bald, pimply heads, and how the women's fingers had little claws, and how their feet had no toes. Then I told her how the Grand High Witch had shot out the fiery white-hot sparks, and how they had turned one of the other witches into a puff of smoke. "I've heard about that," my grandmother cried out excitedly, "but I never quite believed it. You are the first non-witch ever to see it happening." So then I told my grandmother about the delayed action mouse maker, and when I came to the bit about turning all the children of England into mice, she actually leapt out of her chair, shouting, "I knew it! I knew they were brewing up something tremendous." "We've got to stop them," I said. She turned and stared at me. "You can't stop witches," she said. "Just look at the power the terrible Grand High Witch has in her eyes alone. She could kill any of us at any time with those white-hot sparks of hers." "Even so, grandmamma, we've still got to stop her from turning all the children of England into mice." "You haven't quite finished," she said. "Tell me about Bruno. How did they get him?" So I described how Bruno Jenkins had come in, and how I had actually seen him with my own eyes being shrunk into a mouse. My grandmother looked at Bruno. "Does he ever stop eating?" she asked. "Never," I said. "Can you explain something to me, grandmamma?" "I'll try," she said. She reached out and lifted me off the table and put me on her lap. Very gently she began stroking the soft fur along my back. It felt nice. "What is it you want to ask me, my darling?" she said. "The thing I don't understand," I said, "is how Bruno and I are still able to talk and think, just as we did before." "It's quite simple," my grandmother said. "All they've done is to shrink you and give you 4 legs and a furry coat, but they haven't been able to change you into a 100% mouse. You are still yourself in everything except your appearance. You've still got your own mind and your own brain and your own voice, and thank goodness for that." "So I'm not really an ordinary mouse at all," I said. "I'm a sort of mouse person." "Quite right. You are very special." We sat there in silence for a few moments, while my grandmother went on stroking me very gently with one finger and puffing her cigar with the other hand. "Grandmamma," I said, "I may have a bit of an idea." "Yes, my darling, what is it?" "The Grand High Witch told them her room was number 454. My room is number 554. Mine, 554, is on the 5th floor, so hers 454 will be on the 4th floor." "That is correct." "Then don't you think it's possible that room 454 is directly underneath room 554? "That's more than likely," she said. "Would you please take me out onto my balcony so I can look down?" I said. All the rooms in the Hotel Magnificent had small private balconies. My grandmother carried me through into my own bedroom and out onto my balcony. We both peered down to the balcony immediately below. "Now, if that is her room," I said, "and then I'll bet I could climb down there somehow and get in." "And get caught all over again," my grandmother said. "I won't allow it." "At this moment," I said, "all the witches are down on the Sunshine Terrace having tea with the manager. The Grand High Witch probably won't be back until 6 o'clock or just before. That's when she's going to dish out supplies of that foul formula to the ancient ones who are too old to climb trees after Gruntle's eggs." "And what if you did manage to get into her room? What then?" "Then I should try to find the place where she keeps her supply of delayed action mouse maker, and if I succeeded, then I would steal 1 bottle of it and bring it back here." "Could you carry it?" "I think so," I said. "It's a very small bottle." "I'm frightened of that stuff," my grandmother said. "What would you do with it if you did manage to get it?" 1 bottle is enough for 500 people," I said. "That would give each and every witch down there a double dose. At least we could turn them all into mice." My grandmother jumped about an inch in the air. "What an idea!" she said. "It's fantastic. You're a genius, my darling. We get rid of every witch in England in one swoop, and the Grand High Witch into the bargain." "We've got to try it," I said. "Listen, if we brought this off, it would be the greatest triumph in the whole history of witchery." "There's a lot of work to do." "Of course there's a lot of work to do," she said. "Just for a start, supposing you did manage to get hold of one of those bottles, how would you get it into their food?" "We'll work that out later," I said. "Let's try to get the stuff first. How can we find out for sure if that's her room just below us?" "We shall check it out immediately," my grandmother cried. "Come along, there's not a second to waste." We went down the stairs, 1 flight to the 4th floor. The bedrooms on either side of the corridor had their numbers painted on the doors in gold. "Here it is," my grandmother cried. "Number 454. She tried the door. It was locked, of course. "I do believe you're right," she said. "This room is almost certainly directly below yours." She marched back along the corridor, counting the number of doors from the Grand High Witch's room to the staircase. There were 6. She climbed back up to the 5th floor and repeated the exercise. "She is directly below you," my grandmother cried out. She carried me back into my own bedroom and went out once again onto the balcony. "That's her balcony down there," she said. "And what's more, the door from her balcony into her bedroom is wide open. How are you going to climb down?" "I don't know," I said. "I've got it!" my grandmother cried. With me in her hand, she rushed back into her own room and began rummaging in the chest of drawers. She came up with a ball of blue knitting wool. One end of it was attached to some needles and a half-finished sock she had been knitting for me. "This is perfect," she said. "I shall put you in the sock and lower you down onto the Grand High Witch's balcony. But we must hurry. Any moment now that monster will be returning to her room." My grandmother hustled me back into my own bedroom and out onto the balcony. "I hope I can manage this," I said. "I'm only a little mouse." "You'll manage," she said. Good luck, my darling. She popped me into the sock and started lowering me over the balcony. I crouched inside the sock and held my breath. Through the stitches, I could see out quite clearly. Miles below me, the children playing on the beach were the size of beetles. The sock started swinging in the breeze. I looked up and saw my grandmother's head sticking out over the railings of the balcony above. "You're nearly there," she called out. "Here we go. Gently does it. You're down." I felt a slight bump. "In you go!" my grandmother was shouting. "Hurry, hurry! Search the room!" I jumped out of the sock and ran into the Grand High Witch's bedroom. There was the same musty smell about the place that I had noticed in the ballroom. It reminded me of the smell inside the men's public lavatory at our local railway station. As far as I could see, the room was tidy enough. There was no sign anywhere that it was inhabited by anyone but an ordinary person. But then there wouldn't be, would there? Suddenly I saw a frog jumping across the carpet and disappearing under the bed. I jumped myself. "Hurry up!" came my grandmother's voice from somewhere high up outside. "Grab the stuff and get out!" I started skittering round and trying to search the room. This wasn't so easy. I couldn't, for example, open any of the drawers. I sat in the middle of the floor and had a think. If the Grand High Witch wanted to hide something top secret, where would she put it? Certainly not in an ordinary drawer, nor in the wardrobe either. It was too obvious. I jumped up on the bed to get a better view of the room. Hey, I thought, what about under the mattress? Very carefully, I lowered myself over the edge of the bed and wormed my way underneath the mattress. I had to push forward hard to make any headway, but I kept at it. I couldn't see a thing. I was scrabbling about under the mattress when my head suddenly bumped up against something hard inside the mattress above me. I reached up and felt it with my paw. Could it be a little bottle? It was a little bottle. I could trace the shape of it through the cloth of the mattress, and right alongside it I felt another hard lump and another, and another. The Grand High Witch must have slit open the mattress and put all the bottles inside and then sewn it all up again. I began tearing away frantically at the mattress cloth above my head with my teeth. My front teeth were extremely sharp, and it didn't take me long to make a small hole. I climbed into the hole and grabbed a bottle by the neck. I pushed it down through the hole in the mattress and climbed out after it. Walking backwards and dragging the bottle behind me, I managed to reach the edge of the mattress. I rolled the bottle off the bed onto the carpet. It bounced, but it didn't break. I jumped down off the bed. I examined the bottle. It was identical to the one the Grand High Witch had had in the ballroom. There was a label on this one. Formula 86, it said, Delayed Action Mousemaker. Eureka! 3 frogs came hopping out from under the bed. They crouched on the carpet, staring at me with large black eyes. I stared back at them. It suddenly occurred to me that almost certainly, once upon a time, they had been children. "Who are you?" I asked them. At that exact moment I heard a key turning in the lock of the door, and the door burst open, and the Grand High Witch swept into the room. The frogs jumped underneath the bed again in one quick hop. I darted after them. Suddenly the Grand High Witch's face came into view, peering under the bed. I popped my head back behind the bedpost. "So there you are, my little froggies," I heard her saying. "You can stay where you are until I go to bed tonight. Then I shall throw you out of the window, and the seagulls can have you for supper." Suddenly, very loud and clear, there came the sound of my grandmother's voice through the open balcony door. "Hurry up, my darling," it shouted. "You'd better come out quickly." "Who is calling?" snapped the Grand High Witch. I peeped round the bedpost again and saw her walking across the carpet to the balcony door. "Who is this on my balcony?" She went through the door onto the balcony itself. "What is this netting of wool hanging down here?" "Oh, hello," came my grandmother's voice. "I just dropped my knitting over the balcony by mistake, but it's all right. I've got hold of one end of it. I can pull it up by myself. Thank you all the same." I marvelled at the coolness of her voice. "Who were you talking to just now?" snapped the Grand High Witch. "Who were you telling to hurry up and come out quickly?" "I was talking to my little grandson," I heard my grandmother saying. "He's been in the bathroom for hours, and it's time he came out. He sits in there reading books, and he forgets completely where he is. Do you have any children? my dear?"
"I do not!"
shouted the Grand High Witch. She came quickly back into the room, slamming the balcony door behind her. I was cooked. My escape route was closed. There came a knock on the bedroom door.
"What is it this time?"
shouted the Grand High Witch.
"It is we ancient ones,"
said a meek voice from behind the door.
"It is 6 o'clock. We've come to collect the bottles that you promised us. Oh, your grandness."
I saw her crossing the carpet towards the door. The door was opened, and then I saw a whole lot of feet beginning to enter the room. They were coming in slowly and hesitantly, as though the owners of those shoes were frightened of entering. I saw my chance. I jumped out from behind the bedpost and ran like lightning towards the open door, and in 3 seconds I was out in the corridor, still clutching the precious bottle to my chest. No one had seen me. There were no shouts of "Mouse! Mouse!" I went scampering down the corridor to the stairs and up one flight. I went to the 5th floor and then along the corridor again until I came to the door of my own bedroom. Thank goodness there was no one in sight. Using the bottom of the little bottle, I began tap-tap-tapping on the door. But the door didn't open. I decided to take a risk. I shouted as loudly as I possibly could, "Grandmamma, it's me! Let me in!" I heard her feet coming across the carpet, and the door opened. I went in like an arrow. "I've done it!" I cried, jumping up and down. "I've got it, Grandmamma!" She closed the door. She bent down and picked me up and hugged me. "Oh, my darling," she cried. "Thank heavens you're safe." She took the little bottle from me and read the label aloud. "Formula 86 Delayed Action Mouse Maker," she read. "This bottle contains 500 doses. You brilliant darling boy, you're a wonder. How on earth did you get out of her room?" "I nipped out when the ancient witches were coming in," I told him. "I wouldn't want to do it again." "I saw her too," my grandmother said. "I know you did, Grandmamma. I heard you talking to each other. Didn't you think she was absolutely foul?" "She's a murderer," my grandmother said. "She's the most evil woman in the entire world." "Did you see her mask?" I asked. "It's amazing," my grandmother said. "It looks just like a real face." "Oh, my darling," she cried, giving me a hug. "I thought I'd never see you again." My grandmother carried me back into her own bedroom and put me on the table. She set the precious bottle down beside me on the table. "What time are those witches having supper in the dining room?" she asked. 8 o'clock, I said. She looked at her watch. "It's not 6:10, she said. Suddenly her eye fell upon Bruno. He was still in the banana bowl on the table. He had become immensely fat. "That's quite enough," my grandmother said, lifting him out of the bowl and putting him on the tabletop. "I think it's time we return this little fellow to the bosom of his family. Don't you agree, Bruno?" Bruno scowled at her. I had never seen a mouse scowl before, but he managed it. "My parents let me eat as much as I want." "Do you know where your parents might be at this moment?" my grandmother said. "They were in the lounge not long ago," I said. "I saw them sitting there as we dashed through on our way up here." "Right, let's go and see if they're still there. Do you want to come along?" she added, looking at me. "Yes, please," I said. "I shall put you both in my handbag," she said. "Keep quiet and stay out of sight." I had no intention of keeping out of sight. I wanted to see everything. I seated myself in a little side pocket inside the bag near the clasp, and from there I was able to poke my head out whenever I wanted to. We went down in the lift to the ground floor and made our way through the reading room to the lounge. And there, sure enough, sat Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins in a couple of armchairs with a low, round, glass-covered table between them. Mr. Jenkins was reading a newspaper. Mrs. Jenkins was knitting something large and mustard-coloured. Only my nose and eyes were above the clasp of my grandmother's handbag, but I had a super view. My grandmother, dressed in black lace, went thumping across the floor of the lounge and halted in front of the Jenkinses' table. "Are you Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins?" Mr. Jenkins looked at her over the top of his newspaper and frowned. "Yes, I am Mr. Jenkins. What can I do for you, madam?" "I'm afraid I have some rather alarming news for you. It's about your son, Bruno." "What's the little blighter been up to now?" Mr. Jenkins asked. "Raiding the kitchen, I suppose." It's a bit worse than that. Do you think we might go somewhere more private?"
"Private?" Mr. Jenkins said. "Why do we have to be private?"
"This is not an easy thing for me to explain," my grandmother said. "I'd much rather we all went up to your room and sat down before I tell you any more." Mr. Jenkins lowered his paper.
"I don't want to go up to my room, madam," Mr. Jenkins said. "I'm quite comfortable here, thank you very much."
He was a large, coarse man, and he wasn't used to being pushed around.
"Kindly state your business and then leave us alone."
"We really can't talk in here," my grandmother said. "This is a rather delicate and personal matter."
"I'll talk where I dashed well want to, madam. Come on now, out with it. If Bruno's broken a window or smashed your spectacles, then I'll pay for the damage, but I'm not budging out of this seat."
One or two other groups in the room were beginning to stare at us now.
"Where is Bruno, anyway?" Mr. Jenkins said. "Tell him to come here and see me."
"He's here already. He's in my handbag."
"What the heck do you mean, he's in your handbag?" "Are you trying to be funny?" Mrs. Jenkins said, very prim.
"There's nothing funny about this. Your son has suffered a rather unfortunate mishap."
"He's always suffering mishaps," Mr. Jenkins said. "He suffers from overeating, and then he suffers from wind. Where is the little beggar?"
"I've already told you, he's in my handbag. But I do think it might be better if we went somewhere private before you meet him in his present state."
"This woman's mad," Mrs. Jenkins said. "Tell her to go away."
"The plain fact is," my grandmother said, "that your son Bruno has been rather drastically altered."
"Altered?" shouted Mr. Jenkins. "What the devil do you mean, altered?" "Go away," Mrs. Jenkins said. "You're a silly old woman."
"I'm trying to tell you, as gently as possible, that Bruno really is in my handbag. My own grandson actually saw them doing it to him."
"Saw who doing what to him, for heaven's sake?" shouted Mr. Jenkins.
"Saw the witches turning him into a mouse," my grandmother said.
"Call the manager, dear," Mrs. Jenkins said to her husband. "Have this mad woman thrown out of the hotel."
At this point, my grandmother's patience came to an end. She fished around in her handbag and found Bruno. She lifted him out and dumped him on the glass-topped table. Mrs. Jenkins took one look at the fat little brown mouse, who was still chewing a bit of banana, and she let out a shriek that rattled the crystals on the chandelier. She sprang out of her chair, yelling,
"It's a mouse! Take it away! I can't stand the things!"
"It's Bruno," my grandmother said.
"You nasty, cheeky old woman!"
shouted Mr. Jenkins. He started flapping his newspaper at Bruno, trying to sweep him off the table.
"Help!"
screamed Mrs. Jenkins. "Well, I did my best," my grandmother said. And with that, she turned and sailed out of the room, carrying Bruno with her. When we got back to the bedroom, my grandmother took both me and Bruno out of her handbag and put us on the table. "Why on earth didn't you speak up and tell your father who you were?" she said to Bruno.
"Because I had my mouth full,"
Bruno said. "What a very disagreeable little boy you are," my grandmother said to him. "Not a boy," I said. "Mouse." "Quite right, my darling. But we don't have time to worry about him at the moment. We have plans to make. In about an hour and a half's time, all the witches will be going down to supper in the dining room, right?" "Right," I said. "And every one of them has got to be given a dose of mouse makeup. Now, how on earth are we going to do that?" "Grandmama," I said, "I think you're forgetting that a mouse can go places where human beings can't." "That's quite right. But even the mouse can't go creeping around on the tabletop carrying a bottle and sprinkling mouse maker all over the witch's roast beef without being spotted." "I wasn't thinking of doing it in the dining room." "Then where?" "In the kitchen, while the food's being got ready." My grandmother stared at me. "My darling child," she said slowly, "I do believe that turning you into a mouse has doubled your brain power." "A little mouse," I said, "can go scuttling round the kitchen among the pots and pans, and if he's very careful, no one will ever see him." "Brilliant! By golly, I think you've got it." "The only thing is," I said, "how will I know which food is theirs? I don't want to put it in the wrong saucepan. It would be disastrous if I turned all the other guests into mice by mistake, and especially you, Grandmamma." Then you'll just have to creep into the kitchen and find a good hiding place and wait and listen. And then, with a bit of luck, somebody's going to give you a clue. Whenever they have a very big party to cook for, the food is always prepared separately. It's going to be very dangerous. If they see you, they'll squash you to death. I won't let them see me. Don't forget you'll be carrying the bottle, so you won't be nearly so quick and nippy. I can run quite fast, standing up with the bottle in my arms. What about unscrewing the top? That might be difficult for you. Let me try, I said. I took hold of the little bottle, and using both my front paws, I found I was able to unscrew the cap quite easily. "Oh, that's great," my grandmother said. "You really are a clever mouse." She glanced at her watch. "At 7:30, I shall go down to the dining room for supper with you in my handbag. I shall then release you under the table together with the precious bottle, and from then on, you'll be on your own. You're a brave little fellow. I do love you." "What shall we do with Bruno?" Bruno looked up. "I'm coming with you," he said, speaking with his mouth full of banana. "I'm not going to miss my supper." My grandmother considered this for a moment. "I'll take you along if you promise to stay in my bag and keep absolutely silent." "The time has come," my grandmother said. "The great moment has arrived. Are you ready, my darling?" It was exactly 7:30. Bruno was in the bowl, finishing that 4th banana. "Hang on," he said, "just a few more bites." "No," my grandmother said, "we've got to go." She picked him up and held him tight in her hand. She was very tense and nervous. I'd never seen her like that before. "I'm going to put you both in my handbag now, but I shall leave the clasp undone." She popped Bruno into it first. "Now you." She picked me up and gave me a kiss on the nose. "Good luck, my darling. Oh, by the way, you do realize you've got a tail, don't you?" "A what?" "A tail, a long, curly tail." "I must say that never occurred to me," I said. "Good gracious me, so I have. I can actually move it. I mention it only because it might come in useful when you're climbing about in the kitchen. You can curl it around, and you can hook it onto things, and you can swing from it and lower yourself to the ground from high places. I wish I'd known that before. I could have practiced using it. Too late now. We've got to go." My grandmother picked up her walking stick, and out she went into the corridor to the lift. She pressed the button, and the lift came up, and she got in. The lift reached the ground floor and stopped with a jerk. My grandmother walked out of it and crossed the lobby of the hotel and entered the dining room. It was a huge room with gold decorations on the ceiling and big mirrors around the walls. The regular guests always had their tables reserved for them. Our table was a small one beside the right-hand wall about halfway down the room. My grandmother made her way to it and sat down. Peeping out of the handbag, I could see in the very centre of the room 2 long tables that were not yet occupied. Each of them carried a notice fixed onto a sort of silver stick, and the notices said, "Reserved for members of the RSPCC." My grandmother looked towards the long tables, but said nothing. She unfolded her napkin and spread it over the handbag on her lap. Her hand slid under the napkin and took hold of me gently. "I am about to put you on the floor, under the table," she whispered. "The tablecloth reaches almost to the ground, so no one will see you. Have you got hold of the bottle?" "Yes, I'm ready, Grandmamma." Just then a waiter in a black suit came and stood by our table. "Good evening, madam," he said to my grandmother. "Where is the little gentleman tonight?" "He's not feeling very well. He's staying in his room." "I'm sorry to hear that. Today there is green pea soup to start with. For the main course, you have a choice of either grilled fillet of sole or roast lamb. Pea soup and lamb for me, please, but don't hurry it, William. I'm in no rush tonight. In fact, you can bring me a glass of dry sherry first." "Of course, madam." My grandmother pretended she'd dropped something, and as she bent down, she slid me out from under the napkin
onto the floor under the table. "Go, darling, go." I was on my own now. I stood clasping the little bottle. I knew exactly where the door into the kitchen was. I had to go about halfway round the enormous dining room to reach it. Here goes, I thought, and like a flash I skittled out from under the table and made for the wall. I had no intention of going across the dining room floor. It was far too risky. My plan was to cling close to the skirting of the wall all the way round until I reached the kitchen door. I ran. Oh, how I ran! I don't think anyone saw me. But to reach the door to the kitchen, I had to cross the main entrance to the dining room. I was just about to do this when in poured a great flood of females. I pressed myself against the wall, clutching the bottle. At first I saw only the shoes and ankles of these women, who were surging in through the door, but when I glanced up a bit higher I knew at once who they were. They were the witches, coming in to dinner. I waited until they'd all passed me by, then I dashed on towards the kitchen door. A waiter opened it to go in. I nipped in after him and hid behind a big garbage bin on the floor. I stayed there for several minutes, just listening to all the talk and the racket. By golly, what a place that kitchen was! The noise and the steam! Not far above my head there was a handle sticking out from the side of the garbage bin. Still clutching the bottle, I gave a leap, turned a somersault in the air, and caught hold of the handle with the end of my tail. Suddenly there I was, swinging to and fro, upside down. It was terrific. I loved it. This, I told myself, is how a trapeze artist in a circus must feel. Just then a waiter came in, and he shouted, "Everyone in the big RSPCC party wants the soup." I was all ears now. I edged a bit further round the garbage bin so that I could see everything that was going on in the kitchen. A man with a tall white hat, who must have been the head chef, shouted, "Put the soup for the big party in the largest silver soup tureen." I saw the head chef place a huge silver basin onto the wooden side bench that ran along the whole length of the kitchen against the opposite wall. Into that silver basin is where the soup is going, I told myself, so that's where the stuff in my little bottle must go as well. I noticed that high up near the ceiling, above the side bench, there was a long shelf crammed with saucepans and frying pans. If I can somehow clamber up onto that shelf, I thought, then I've got it made. I shall be directly above the silver basin. But first, I must somehow get across to the other side of the kitchen and then up onto the middle shelf. A great idea came to me. Once again, I jumped up and hooked my tail around the handle of the garbage bin. Then, hanging upside down, I began to swing. Higher and higher I swung. I was remembering the trapeze artist in the circus I'd seen last Easter, and the way he'd got the trapeze swinging higher and higher and higher, and had then let go and gone flying through the air. So, just at the right moment, at the top of my swing, I let go with my tail and went soaring clear across the kitchen and made a perfect landing on the middle shelf. By golly, I thought, what marvellous things a mouse can do, and I'm only a beginner. No one had seen me. They were all far too busy with their pots and pans. From the middle shelf I somehow managed to shinny up a little water pipe in the corner, and in no time at all I was up on the very top shelf, just under the ceiling, among all the saucepans and the frying pans. I knew that no one could possibly see me up there. I began working my way along the shelf until I was directly above the big empty silver basin they were going to pour the soup into. I put down my bottle. I unscrewed the top and crept to the edge of the shelf and quickly poured what was in it straight into the silver basin below. The next moment, one of the cooks came along with a gigantic saucepan of steaming green soup and poured the whole lot into the silver basin. Then a waiter arrived and carried the silver basin away. I'd done it. Even if I never got back alive to my grandmother, the witches were still going to get the mouse-maker. I left the empty bottle behind a large saucepan and began working my way back along the top shelf. It was much easier to move about without the bottle. I began using my tail more and more. I swung from the handle of one saucepan to the handle of another all the way along that top shelf. I swung most marvellously from handle to handle, and I was enjoying myself so much that I completely forgot I was in full view of anyone in the kitchen who might happen to glance upwards. What came next happened so quickly I had no time to save myself. I heard a man's voice yelling, "A mouse! Look at that dirty little mouse!" And I caught a glimpse below me of a white-coated figure in a tall white hat, and then there was a flash of steel as the carving knife whizzed through the air, and there was a shoot of pain in the end of my tail, and suddenly I was falling and falling, head first, towards the floor. Even as I fell, I knew just what had happened. I knew that the tip of my tail had been cut off. and that I was about to crash onto the floor, and everyone in the kitchen would be after me. I hit the floor and jumped up and ran for my life. All around me there were big black boots going stamp, 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 and I dodged around them and ran and ran and ran. "Get it!" they were shouting. "Kill it! Stamp on it!" The whole floor seemed to be full of black boots stamping away at me. Hardly knowing what I was doing, wanting only a place to hide, I ran up the trouser leg of one of the cooks and clung to his sock. "Hey!" the cook shouted. "Jeepers creepers! He's got up my trouser! Hold on, boys! I'll get him this time!" The man's hands began slapping at the trouser leg, and now I really was going to get smashed if I didn't move quickly. There was only one way to go, and that was up. I dug my little claws into the hairy skin of the man's leg and scuttled upwards, higher and higher, past the calf and past the knee and onto the thigh. "Holy smoke!" the man was yelling. "It's going all the way up! It's going right up my leg!" I heard shrieks of laughter coming from the other cooks, but I can promise you, I wasn't laughing myself. I was running for my life. The man's hands were slapping all around me, and he was jumping up and down as though he was standing on hot bricks, and I kept climbing and kept dodging, and very soon I reached the very top of the trouser leg, and there was nowhere else to go. "Help! Help! Help!" the man was screaming. "It's in my knickers! It's running round in my flaming knickers!" "Take your trousers off, you silly slob!" someone else shouted. "Pull down your pants, and we'll soon catch him." I was in the middle of the man's trousers now, in the place where the two trouser legs meet and the zip begins. It was dark and awfully hot in there. I knew I had to keep going. I dashed onward and found the top of the other trouser leg. I went down it like greased lightning and came out at the bottom of it. I caught a flashing glimpse of the entire kitchen staff crowding round him and laughing their heads off, and nobody saw the little brown mouse as it flew across the floor and dived into a sack of potatoes. I burrowed down in among the dirty potatoes and held my breath. The cook must have started taking his trousers right off, because now they were shouting, "It's not in there! There's no mice in there, you silly twerp! There was! I swear there was!" The fact that a tiny little creature like me had caused such a commotion among a bunch of grown-up men gave me a happy feeling. I couldn't help smiling, in spite of the pain in my tail. I stayed where I was until I was sure they had forgotten about me. Then I crept out of the potatoes and cautiously poked my tiny head over the edge of the sack. Once again, the kitchen was all of a bustle. But I had to get out of that kitchen and back to my grandmother. There was only one way to do this. I must make a dash, clear across the floor and out through the door behind one of the waiters. I stayed quite still, waiting for my chance. My tail was hurting terribly. There was a waiter loading up with a batch of plates full of pink ice cream. He went towards the door. He pushed it open with his shoulder. I leapt out of the sack of potatoes and went across that kitchen floor and into the dining room like a streak of light, and I didn't stop running until I was underneath my grandmother's table. It was lovely to see my grandmother's feet again, in those old-fashioned black shoes with their straps and buttons. I shinned up one of her legs and landed on her lap. "Hello, Grandmama," I whispered. "I'm back. I did it. I poured it all into their soup." Her hand came down and caressed me. "Well done, my darling," she whispered back. "Well done, you. They are at this very moment eating that soup." Suddenly she withdrew her hand. "You're bleeding," she whispered. "My darling, what's happened to you?" "One of the cooks cut off my tail with a carving knife." "Let me look at it," she said. She bent her head and examined my tail. "You poor little thing," she whispered. "I'm going to bandage it up with my handkerchief. That will stop the bleeding. Did you really manage to pour the whole bottle into their soup?" "Every drop." "Do you think you could put me where I can watch them?" "Yes. My handbag is on your own empty chair beside me. I'm going to pop you in there now, and you can peep out as long as you're careful not to be seen. Bruno is there as well, but take no notice of him. I gave him a roll to eat, and that's keeping him busy for a while." I peered over the top of the handbag. I could see the witches quite clearly, sitting at their two long tables in the centre of the room. They had finished their soup now, and the waiters were clearing away the plates. My grandmother had lit up one of her disgusting black cigars and was puffing smoke over everything. All around us, the summer holiday guests in this rather grand hotel were babbling away and tucking into their suppers. "That's her, Grandmama," I whispered. "That's the Grand High Witch." "I know," my grandmother whispered back. "She's the tiny one in the black, sitting at the head of the nearest table."
She could kill you, I whispered. She could kill anyone in this room with her white-hot sparks. Look out, my grandmother whispered. The waiter's coming.
I popped down out of sight, and I heard William saying, "Your roast lamb, madam. And which vegetable would you like, peas or carrots?" "Carrots, please, but no potatoes." I heard the carrots being dished out. There was a pause. Then my grandmother's voice was whispering,
"It's all right. He's gone."
I popped my head up again.
"Surely no one will notice my little head sticking out like this," I whispered. "No, I don't suppose they will. My problem is I've got to talk to you without moving my lips."
"You're doing beautifully."
"I've counted the witches. There aren't nearly as many as you thought."
"How many are there?"
84.
"There were 85, I said, but one of them got fried. At that moment I caught sight of Bruno's father, heading straight for our table.
"Look out, Grandmama," I whispered. "Here comes Bruno's father."
Mr. Jenkins came striding up to our table with a very purposeful look on his face.
"Where is that grandson of yours?"
he said to my grandmother. He spoke rudely and looked very angry. My grandmother put on her frostiest look, but didn't answer him.
"My guess is that he and my son Bruno are up to some devilment. Bruno hasn't turned up for his supper, and it takes a lot to make that boy miss his food."
"I must admit he has a very healthy appetite," my grandmother said.
"My feeling is that you're in on this as well," Mr. Jenkins said. "I don't know who the devil you are, and I don't much care, but you played a nasty trick on me and my wife this afternoon."
"That was no trick I played on you. That mouse I tried to give you was your own little boy, Bruno. I was trying to restore him to the bosom of his family."
"What the blazes do you mean, madam?" shouted Mr. Jenkins. "My son isn't a mouse."
His black moustache was jumping up and down like crazy as he spoke.
"Come on, woman! Where is he? Out with it!"
The family at the table nearest to us had all stopped eating and were staring at Mr. Jenkins. My grandmother sat there, puffing away calmly at her black cigar.
"I can well understand your anger, Mr. Jenkins. Any other English father would be just as cross as you are. But over in Norway, where I come from, we are quite used to these sort of happenings." "You must be mad, woman," cried Mr. Jenkins. "Where is Bruno? If you don't tell me at once, I shall summon the police."
"Bruno is a mouse."
"He most certainly is not a mouse."
"Oh, yes, I am," Bruno said, poking his head up out of the handbag. Mr. Jenkins leapt about 3 feet into the air. "Hello, Dad." Mr. Jenkins's mouth dropped open so wide I could see the gold fillings in his back teeth. "Don't worry, Dad. It's not as bad as all that. Just as long as the cat doesn't get me."
But, Bruno," stammered Mr. Jenkins again. "How did this happen?"
"Witches," my grandmother said. "The witches did it."
"I can't have a mouse for a son,"
shrieked Mr. Jenkins. "You've got one," my grandmother said. "Be nice to him, Mr. Jenkins."
"Mrs. Jenkins will go crazy."
"She'll just have to get used to him. I hope you don't keep a cat in the house."
We do, cried Mr. Jenkins. "Topsy is my wife's favourite creature."
"Then you'll just have to get rid of Topsy. Your son is more important than your cat."
"He certainly is," Bruno shouted from inside the handbag. "You tell Mum she's got to get rid of Topsy before I go home."
By now, half the dining room was watching our little group. "By the way," my grandmother said, "would you like to know who did this to him?"
"Who?" he cried. "Who did it?"
"That woman over there," my grandmother said. "The small one in the black dress at the head of the long table."
"She's RSPCC," cried Mr. Jenkins. "She's the chairwoman."
"No, she's not. She's the Grand High Witch of all the world. I wouldn't do anything rash," my grandmother said to him. "That woman has magic powers. She might decide to turn you into something even sillier than a mouse. A cockroach, perhaps."
"Turn me into a cockroach?" shouted Mr. Jenkins, puffing out his chest. "I'd like to see her try."
He swung round and started marching across the dining room toward the Grand High Witch's table. My grandmother and I watched him. Bruno had jumped up onto our table and was also watching his father. Practically everyone in the dining room was watching Mr. Jenkins now. I stayed where I was, peeping out of my grandmother's handbag. I thought it might be wiser to stay put. Mr. Jenkins had not gone more than a few paces towards the Grand High Witch's table when a piercing scream rose high above all the other noises in the room, and at the same moment I saw the Grand High Witch go shooting up into the air. Now she was standing on her chair, still screaming. Now she was on the tabletop. "What on earth's happening, Grandmamma?" "Wait, keep quiet and watch." Suddenly all the other witches, more than 80 of them, were beginning to scream and jump out of their seats as though spikes were being stuck into their bottoms. And all at once they became quiet. Then they all stiffened. Every single witch stood there as stiff and silent as a corpse. The whole room became deathly still. "They're shrinking, Grandmamma," I said. "They're shrinking, just like I did." "I know they are," my grandmother said. "It's the mouse maker," I cried. "Look, some of them are growing fur on their faces. Why is it working so quickly, Grandmamma?" "I tell you why. Because all of them have had massive overdoses, just like you." Everyone in the dining room was standing up now to get a better view. People were moving closer. They were beginning to crowd round the two long tables. My grandmother lifted Bruno and me up so that we wouldn't miss any of the fun. In her excitement, she jumped up onto her chair so that she could see over the heads of the crowd. In another few seconds, all the witches had completely disappeared, and the tops of the two long tables were swarming with small brown mice. All over the dining room, women were screaming, and strong men were turning white in the face and shouting, "It's crazy! This can't happen! Let's get the heck out of here, quick!" Waiters were attacking the mice with chairs and wine bottles and anything else that came to hand. I saw a chef in a tall white hat rushing out from the kitchen, brandishing a frying pan, and another one, just behind him, was wielding a carving knife above his head. And everyone was yelling, "Mice! Mice! Mice! We must get rid of the mice!" Only the children in the room were really enjoying it. They all seemed to know instinctively that something good was going on in front of them, and they were clapping and cheering and laughing like mad. "It's time to go," my grandmother said. "Our work is done." She got down off her chair and picked up her handbag and slung it over her arm. She had me in her right hand and Bruno in her left. "Bruno, the time has come to restore you to the famous bosom of your family. My mum's not very crazy about mice." "So I noticed. She'll just have to get used to you, won't she?" It was not difficult to find Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins. You could hear Mrs. Jenkins's shrill voice all over the room. "Herbert! Herbert! Get me out of here! There's mice everywhere! They'll go up my skirts!" She had her arms high up around her husband, and from where I was, she seemed to be swinging from his neck. My grandmother advanced upon them and thrust Bruno into Mr. Jenkins's hand. "Here's your little boy. He needs to go on a diet." "Hi, Dad," Bruno said. "Hi, Mum." Mrs. Jenkins screamed even louder. My grandmother, with me in her hand, turned and marched out of the room. She went straight across the hotel lobby and out through the front entrance, into the open air. Outside it was a lovely warm evening, and I could hear the waves breaking on the beach just across the road from the hotel. "Is there a taxi here?" my grandmother said to the tall doorman in his green uniform. "Certainly, madam," he said, and he put 2 fingers into his mouth and blew a long, shrill whistle. I watched him with envy. For weeks I'd been trying to whistle like that, but I hadn't succeeded once. Now I never would. The taxi came. The driver was an oldish man. "Drive us to the station, please." "Yes, ma'am, right away." My grandmother got into the back of the taxi and sat down and put me on her lap. "Are we going home?" I asked her. "Yes, back to Norway." "Hooray! Oh, hooray, hooray, hooray! I thought you'd like that," she said. "But what about our luggage?" "Who cares about luggage? How are you feeling, my darling?" "Fine, quite marvellous." "We have accomplished great feats today. It's been terrific, absolutely terrific." It was lovely to be back in Norway once again, in my grandmother's fine old house. But now that I was so small, everything looked different. After a few days, my grandmother began to invent gadgets for me in order to make life a bit easier. She got a carpenter to put together a number of slim, tall step-ladders, and she placed one of these against each table in the house so that I could climb up whenever I wanted to.
She herself invented a wonderful door-opening device made out of wires and springs and pulleys with heavy weights dangling on cords, and soon every door in the house had a door-opener on it. Next, she rigged up an equally ingenious system whereby I could switch on the light whenever I entered a room at night. I cannot explain how it worked, because I know nothing about electricity, but there was a little button let into the floor near the door in every room in the house, and when I pressed the button gently with one paw, the light would come on. When I pressed it a second time, the light would go off again. My grandmother made me a tiny toothbrush, using a matchstick for the handle, and into this she stuck little bits of bristle that she had snipped off one of her hairbrushes. "You must not get any holes in your teeth," she said. "I can't take a mouse to a dentist. He'd think I was crazy." It's funny, but ever since I became a mouse, I've hated the taste of sweets and chocolates, so I don't think I'll get any holes. "You're still going to brush your teeth after every meal," my grandmother said. And I did. For a bathtub, she gave me a silver sugar basin, and I bathed in it every night before going to bed. We kept entirely to ourselves, and we were very happy in each other's company. One evening, as I lay on my grandmother's lap in front of the fire, she said to me, "I wonder what's happened to that little Bruno." "I wouldn't be surprised if his father gave him to the hall porter to drown in the fire bucket," I answered. "I'm afraid you may be right. The poor little thing." We were silent for a few minutes, my grandmother puffing away at her black cigar, while I dozed comfortably in the warmth. "Can I ask you something, Grandmamma?" "Ask me anything you like, my darling." "How long does a mouse live?" "Ah, I've been waiting for you to ask me that." There was a silence. She sat there smoking away and gazing at the fire. "Well, how long do we live? Us mice?" "I've been reading about mice. I've been trying to find out everything I can about them." "Go on then, Grandmamma. Why don't you tell me?" "If you really want to know, I'm afraid a mouse doesn't live for very long." "How long?" "Well, an ordinary mouse only lives for about 3 years. But you are not an ordinary mouse. You are a mouse person, and it's a very different matter." "How different?" "How long does a mouse person live, Grandmamma?" "Oh, longer. Much longer." "How much longer?" "A mouse person will almost certainly live for 3 times as long as an ordinary mouse," my grandmother said. "About 9 years. "Good. That's great. It's the best news I've ever had." "Why do you say that?" she asked, surprised. "Because I would never want to live longer than you," I said. There was a short silence. She had a way of fondling me behind the ears with the tip of one finger. It felt lovely. "How old are you, Grandmamma?" "I'm 86. "Will you live another 8 or 9 years?" "I might, with a bit of luck." "You've got to, because by then I'll be a very old mouse, and you'll be a very old grandmother, and soon after that we'll both die together." "That would be perfect. Would you like me to tell you something about yourself that is very interesting?" "Yes, please, Grandmamma." "I couldn't believe it at first, but apparently it's quite true." "What is it?" "The heart of a mouse, that means your heart, is beating at the rate of 500 times a minute. Isn't that amazing?" "That's not possible." "It's as true as I'm sitting here. It's a sort of miracle." "That's nearly 9 beats every second," I cried, working it out in my head. "Correct." The two of us remained silent in front of the fire for a long time after that, thinking about these wonderful things. "My darling," she said at last, "are you sure you don't mind being a mouse for the rest of your life?" "I don't mind at all. It doesn't matter who you are or what you look like, so long as somebody loves you." For supper that evening, my grandmother had a plain omelette and 1 slice of bread. I had a piece of that brown Norwegian goat's milk cheese, known as Gjetost, which I had loved even when I was a boy. Grandmama, now that we've done away with the Grand High Witch, will all the other witches in the world gradually disappear? I'm sure they won't. I stopped chewing and stared at her. But they must, I cried. Surely they must. No, I'm afraid not. But if she's not there any longer, how are they going to get all the money they need? And who's going to give them orders and jazz them up at the annual meetings? When the queen bee dies, there is always another queen in the hive ready to take her place, my grandmother said. It's the same with witches. In the great headquarters, where the Grand High Witch lives, there's always another Grand High Witch waiting in the wings to take over should anything happen. Oh, no. That means everything we did was for nothing. Have I become a mouse for nothing at all? We saved the children of England. I don't call that nothing. I know, but I felt sure that all the witches of the world would slowly fade away after we'd got rid of their leader. Now you tell me that everything's going to go on just the same as before. Not exactly as before. For instance, there are no longer any witches in England. That's quite a triumph, isn't it? But what about the rest of the world? What about America and France and Holland and Germany? And what about Norway? You must not think that I've been sitting back and doing nothing these last few days. I've been giving a great deal of thought and time to that particular problem. I was looking up at her face. Why are you smiling, Grandmama? I have some rather interesting news for you. What news? Should I tell it to you right from the beginning? Yes, please. I like good news. She had finished her omelette, and I had had enough of my cheese. As soon as we arrived back in Norway, I picked up the telephone and made a call to England. Who in England, Grandmama? To the Chief of Police in Bournemouth, my darling. I told him I was the Chief of Police for the whole of Norway, and that I was interested in the peculiar happenings that had taken place recently in the Hotel Magnificent. Now, hang on a sec, Grandmama. There's no way an English policeman's going to believe that you are the head of the Norwegian police. I'm very good at imitating a man's voice. Of course he believed me. The policeman in Bournemouth was honoured to get a call from the Chief of Police for the whole of Norway. So what did you ask him? I asked him for the name and address of the lady who had been living in room 454 in the Hotel Magnificent, the one who disappeared. You mean the Grand High Witch? Yes, my darling. And did he give it to you? Naturally he gave it to me. One policeman will always help another policeman. By golly, you've got a nerve, Grandmama. I wanted her address. But did he know her address? He did indeed. They had found her passport in her room, and her address was in it. It was also in the hotel register. Everyone who stays in an hotel has to put a name and address in the book. But surely the Grand High Witch wouldn't have put her real name and address in the hotel register. Why, even not. My grandmother said nobody in the world had the faintest idea who she was, except the other witches. Even in her home district, in the village where she lived, people knew her as a kindly and very wealthy baroness who gave large sums of money to charity. I have checked up on that. I was getting excited now. And that address you got, Grandmama, that must have been the secret headquarters of the Grand High Witch. It still is. And that will be where the new Grand High Witch is certain to be living at this very moment with her retinue of special assistant witches. Where is her headquarters, Grandmama? I cried. Tell me quick where it is. It is a castle. And the fascinating thing is that in that castle will be all the names and addresses of all the witches in the world. Where is the castle, Grandmama? I cried impatiently. Which country? Guess. Norway, I cried. Right first time. High up in the mountains, above a small village. This was thrilling news. So we have work to do, you and I, she cried out. We have a great task ahead of us. Thank heavens you are a mouse. All I'll have to do is to put you down somewhere near the Grand High Witch's castle, and you will very easily be able to get inside and creep around looking and listening to your heart's content. I will. You could spend days in there if necessary, my grandmother cried. In her excitement, she was waving her stick all over the place, and suddenly she knocked over a tall and very beautiful vase that went crashing onto the floor and smashed into 1,000,000 pieces. Forget it! It's only Ming! You could spend weeks in that castle if you wanted to, and they'd never know you were there.
I myself would get a room in the village, and you could sneak out of the castle and have supper with me every night and tell me what was going on. I could, but your main job, of course, would be to destroy every witch in the place. That really would be the end of the whole organization. Me? Destroy them? How could I do that? Can't you guess? Tell me. Mouse Maker! My grandmother shouted. Formula 86 delayed action Mouse Maker all over again. You'll feed it to everyone in the castle by putting drops of it into their food. You do remember the recipe, don't you? Well, every bit of it. You mean we're going to make it ourselves? Why not? If they can make it, so can we. It's just a question of knowing what goes into it. Who's going to climb up the tall trees to get the gruntle's eggs? I will. I'll do it myself. There's plenty of life in this old dog yet. I think I'd better do that part of it, Grandmama. You might come a cropper. These are just details, she cried, waving her stick again. We shall let nothing stand in our way. And what happens after that? After the new Grand High Witch and everyone else in the castle have been turned into mice. But then the castle will be completely empty, and I shall come in and join you and— Wait, I cried. Hold on, Grandmama, I've just had a nasty thought. What nasty thought? When the mouse maker turned me into a mouse, I didn't become just any old ordinary mouse that you catch with mouse traps. I became a talking, thinking, intelligent mouse person who wouldn't go near a mouse trap. My grandmother stopped dead in her tracks. She already knew what was coming next. Therefore, I went on, if we use the mouse maker to turn the new Grand High Witch and all the other witches in the castle into mice, the whole place will be swarming with very clever, very nasty, very dangerous, talking, thinking mouse witches. They'll all be witches in mouse's clothing. And that could be very horrible indeed. By golly, you're right, she said. That never occurred to me. I couldn't possibly take on a castle full of mouse witches, nor could I. They'd have to be got rid of at once. They'd have to be smashed and bashed and chopped up into little pieces, exactly as they were in the Hotel Magnificent. I'm not doing that. I couldn't anyway. I don't think you could either, Grandmama, and mousetraps wouldn't be the slightest use. By the way, I added, the Grand High Witch who did me in was wrong about mousetraps, wasn't it? Yes, my grandmother said impatiently, but I'm not concerned with that Grand High Witch. It's the new Grand High Witch we've got to deal with now. I've got it! I shouted, leaping about a foot in the air. I've got the answer! Tell me, my grandmother snapped. The answer is cats! Bring on the cats! My grandmother stared at me. Then a great grin spread over her face, and she shouted, It's brilliant! Absolutely brilliant! Shove half a dozen cats into that castle, I cried, and they'll kill every mouse in the place in 5 minutes. I don't care how clever they are. You're a magician, my grandmother shouted, starting to wave her stick about once again. Look out for the vases, Grandmama. To heck with the vases, she shouted. I'm so thrilled I don't care if I break the lot. Just one thing. You've got to make absolutely sure I'm well out of the way myself before you put the cats in. Well, that's a promise. What will we do after the cats have killed all the mice? I'll take all the cats back to the village, and then you and I will have the castle completely to ourselves. And then? Then we shall go through the records and get the names and addresses of all the witches in the whole wide world. And after that, I said, quivering with excitement, after that, my darling, the greatest task of all will begin for you and me. We shall pack our bags and go travelling all over the world. In every country we visit, we shall seek out the houses where the witches are living. We shall find each house one by one, and having found it, you will creep inside and leave your little drops of deadly mouse-maker in the bread or the cornflakes or the rice pudding or whatever food you see lying about. It will be a triumph, my darling, a colossal, unbeatable triumph. We shall do it entirely by ourselves, just you and me. That will be our work for the rest of our lives. My grandmother picked me up off the table and kissed me on the nose. Oh, my goodness me, we are going to be busy these next few weeks and months and years, she cried. I think we are, I said. But what fun and excitement it's going to be. You can say that again.
my grandmother cried, giving me another kiss.
I can't wait to get started.